I'm Cara Santa Maria, and this is Naked Mormonism.
I pledge my life, all that I may have. I will strive to the utmost of my ability to be what you would want me to be.
It's time to find the truth.
And having set our hand to the plow, we will never look back until this work is finished.
Where's the church going?
I have faith that the Constitution will be saved as prophesied by Joseph Smith. But it will not be saved in Washington. It will be saved by enlightened members of this church.
The explicit tag is there for a reason, so if you get offended at what's said, it's not for you. But most importantly,
may you ponder the truths you've heard. May they help you become even better than you were.
Skepticize everything.
Welcome to episode 46 of the Naked Mormonism podcast, the serial Mormon history podcast. Today is Thursday, January 19th, 2017. My name is Bryce Blankenagel, and thank you for joining me. Before we round up what happened last historical episode, and then, of course, jump into the meat of today's episode, we need to take a few minutes and discuss this previous weekend and the live god-awful movies in Chicago. It was amazing. So in case any of you aren't familiar with it, and I really can't imagine that describes anybody by this point, but God Awful Movies is the podcast where Noah, Heath, and Eli of Scathing Atheist review really shitty Christian movies. It's truly one of the best and funniest podcasts out there, and they've become successful enough to pull off live events in New York and the UK and now in Chicago. Last weekend, they teamed up with their good friends, Tom and Cecil of Cognitive Dissonance. I mean, this was bringing together the most incredible docket of offensive podcasters in existence, talking about a horrifically offensive Christian movie. It was amazing. They reviewed a movie called A Right to Believe. It's my right to believe, which, I mean, it should have been titled The Right to Be a Bigoted Asshole or something, because it was all about this Christian newspaper writer wanting to just be a miserable, hateful fuck against gay people prior to a gay pride parade in his town. Now, I won't cover any more of the movie, but that's the premise of it. Just listen to the episode. Gamcast rips this thing a new asshole while simultaneously painting an amazing picture for us. So just do yourself the service, follow the show notes for the God Awful Movies, and give that episode a listen. Before they even began reviewing the movie, Eli came out in what he must have considered a wrestling uniform, but it was like Chippendale, kind of, because like every wrinkle and fold of his junk was visible, and I was sitting at the back of the theater. I mean, for better or worse, they don't record video of these productions, so you're kind of spared the horrifying visual of Eli's penis, which everybody came to know as unchallenging. But you still missed out on all the other visually hilarious shenanigans. So if you ever have the chance to go to a live God Awful Movies, it will change your fucking life. Okay? Listen to me. It was amazing. Nobody left the Victory Biograph Theater on Friday night unaffected. Simple as that. And, you know, I also walked down the alleyway in which John Dillinger was shot. So, you know, there's lots of cool history in Chicago. But of course, that's a digression. The live show was only the beginning of the fun, as the majority of the 300 people nearly in the theater walked across the street and filled a bar to the point of just, there wasn't even standing room in there. And that's where we all got to properly hang out and actually meet each other and have conversations, as opposed to like just watching the 5 people on the stage entertain us. So this hangout was truly the highlight of the trip, hands down. I mean, I was able to meet a bunch of fellow Gamcast and Scathing Atheist and Cogdis fans. And it's such a fun community to be part of. Surprisingly enough, I had the opportunity to meet a couple faces I'd met before at the Mythicist Milwaukee debate a few months ago, as well as a few people that actually listened to the show. I mean, it was amazing. On last week's episode, I said I was hoping to meet some of you there, and it happened. I couldn't believe it. A kind of a funny situation happened. A big group of us were standing outside talking about the Book of Mormon introduction that they did a couple weeks back on the Scathing Atheist. And one guy in the circle started talking about how excited he was for them to read the Book of Mormon, because last year with the Quran and Chronomaniacs, it was pretty rough. There really wasn't much fun going on in the Quran. It's a horrible book. But the guy literally standing right next to me, I mean, he was standing close enough to smell me, said to Noah, yeah, all I know about Mormonism is what that Bryce Blankenagel guy has said on the show. And Noah pointed to me, standing right next to the guy. The guy just stopped for a second and was like, what are you? And I'm like, yeah, I'm Bryce Blankenagel. Nice to meet you, man. And like, it was just like this kind of weird serendipitous moment, you know, in retelling the story. It's kind of lame, but at the time it was pretty funny. We got a chuckle out of it. But the rest of the night I just spent bouncing around the Mythicist Milwaukee guys, Heath. There was another guy with a tramp stamp that was a giant butterfly with a cock for a body, a tattoo, which Tom of Cognitive Dissonance had just enough battery on his phone to take a picture of. Hung out with Andrew Torres, who's my good friend and legal counsel for this podcast, who's also the guest host of Opening Arguments. Truly, Opening Arguments is the best new podcast in the atheist and skeptical genre. Truly, it's the best. Check out Opening Arguments. And then, of course, by the end of the night, I was hanging out with Ari Stillman of the Gaytheist Manifesto and Eli Bosnick. So if you're into any of the podcasts that I just listed, you have to come to an event like this. The next one that's, a big event that all of these same people will be attending is ReasonCon, and that's in mid-April of 2017, hosted in Hickory, North Carolina. Now, if there's a single convention you can make it to this year, make ReasonCon that convention. There's still a few months left to plan your trip if you're listening to this, not just in the backlog. If you're listening to this at the time they come out before April of 2017, do yourself a favor and go to ReasonCon. Beside that, on the Sunday after the show, I went up to Milwaukee, took the train from Chicago to Milwaukee, really nice ride. And while I was up there, I did an interview with the Mythicist Milwaukee group, and you'll be hearing part 2 of that discussion on this episode. Part 1 is hosted over on the Mythicist Milwaukee podcast feed. But one thing we discussed was what it's like to leave the church. I told Sean and Brian that the church has an amazing social and community-based structure in place. Bar none. Often when people leave the church, that entire social foundation is just stripped away from them without anywhere to turn. So if you want to take part in an open and loving community, this community is it, this atheist and skeptical community. The best part I find is the overwhelming sense of inclusiveness without all the bullshit pretensions. I mean, Noah and I spent over 4 hours in a hotel room disagreeing on everything from polyandry to the milestones being made in AI advancement with CRISPR technology and what universal technological advancement means for Fermi's paradox. And if an alien race exists out there far more advanced than us, have they just killed themselves off with their technology as we've nearly done a small handful of times? I mean, we were constantly calling each other out on our facts and claiming skepticism when a strong case wasn't being presented. We were able to knock holes in each other's echo chambers, and it was downright fun. Now, this may not be the case for many of the listeners, but I don't know if I ever felt that same sense of camaraderie I felt at this live podcast while I was attending church. When I was in church, I felt friendship with the people that I spent time with outside of the church, but church itself wasn't necessarily the place where I felt at home, inside of a community. Let's face it, one of the main reasons people stay in the church when they don't believe in it is the sense of community and fear of what will happen with their family or their job or their friends or whatever when they leave the church. Well, I'm here to tell you that you can attain that sense of community outside of the church. It exists out there. It just requires more effort to be a part of it. Instead of going a few miles to church every Sunday and giving 10% of your overall income, to feel the sense of community that I'm describing here and that I felt this past weekend, it requires getting off our collective asses and finding an open-minded group like the atheist and skeptical community. That means logging into meetups or Facebook groups and actually going out to a local monthly hangout. It means saving some extra cash to be able to afford a weekend in Chicago or North Carolina or Seattle or wherever for a convention or a live show. But it's not going to cost anywhere near 10% of your gross income, of course. But the community won't come to you. Okay? That's the harsh reality. If you don't get out there and put yourself out there, you'll never have this broader sense of community that's so important to human survival. Only when you occasionally stand in a convention center with 1,500 like-minded people do you feel that overwhelming sense of empowering solidarity. It's something for which I could have never assigned a value without having experienced it for myself. And please don't take my word for it. I mean, you try it for yourself. I mean, you don't even have to have an experience like my good friend Preston. He wanted to go to an ex-Mormon meetup for quite a few months, and the day that he finally got up the courage and made the time to do it, when he arrived at where the hangout was, he just sat in his Jeep in the parking lot for a few minutes. Just almost terrified of what it meant in his life if he joined up with an apostate group. That day that he got up the courage and actually went to this ex-Mormon hangout, he became part of a group that invited him in with open arms and didn't judge him based on how nice of a suit he had, how many kids he had, or what kind of car he drove. Maybe I'm just beating a dead horse by this point, but I guess it comes down to whether or not you value a sense of community with kindred spirits, right? Nothing I could say will convince you, the listener, to go to ReasonCon in April. You have to convince yourself. You have to make a judgment call and decide if it's worth the investment of time, money, and energy, most importantly. I can only tell you from having attended a number of these conventions now, personally, the benefits I reap from being there constantly draws me back for more at nearly any cost. Going to these conventions is almost an addiction, but really, it's a pretty good addiction to be suffering from, in my opinion. But all of that aside, let's step aside from that discussion. Chicago is an awesome city. It was my first time in actual downtown Chicago. I spent the time, I wasn't hanging out with other podcasters, just touring the Chicago History Museum, the Science and Industry Museum, where I walked around a captured German U-boat from 1944. That was really cool. Went to the Lincoln Park Zoo, walked up and down Michigan Avenue and stared at a gigantic chrome bean. I don't know what that was all about. And more than anything else, I just absorbed the atmosphere and old architecture of Chicago. It was so cool. I can't wait to go back when my hands have finally unfrozen from their current claw-like state. I mean, seriously, okay, Chicago in January is not a habitable place for humans to live. I don't know how people do it. But, all right, that's I think everything I needed to mention for now. Let's go on to today's episode, okay? Given the time restraint this last weekend is placed on the regular schedule, normally I have many more hours to put into compiling a historical episode. Today's episode is going to be a little bit of a shorter history segment with the discussion portion, the part 2 of the Mythicist Milwaukee interview tacked on at the end. So last episode, of course, last week was a discussion with Cara Santa Maria and then some random musings from yours truly. But the last historical timeline episode covered so much time and a number of confusing events, all leading up to Governor Lilburn Boggs' Mormon extermination order. We didn't quite get to that specifically, as that was kind of getting a bit ahead of ourselves, but last historical episode we began with proper introductions for Generals Alexander Donovan and David Atchison, 2 non-Mormon lawyers and generals of the state militia who were friendly to the Mormons. These 2 men would be the legal counsel for Joe and Lyman White during their preliminary hearing on this guy Ragland's farm. This preliminary hearing was to determine if there was sufficient evidence to move forward to a grand jury trial and, eventually convict these 2 men of mob violence, as, The Danites had surrounded the homes of government officials and imposed their will upon them. That was illegal. So Judge Austin A. King, presiding, came down with the judgment that there was enough evidence to move forward with the grand jury trial, a verdict the Mormons saw as unfair, but was probably the best option given the angry anti-Mormon mob surrounding them. Truly anything to stop a riot from breaking out was a good move. After that, we discussed the rumors proliferating that were claiming the Mormons were trying to ally themselves with the Native Americans. There's no evidence to suggest it's true, but I personally think it's entirely possible. I made my case last episode. Go back and listen if you disagree with me. I'd love to contend with anybody who disagrees. But after talking about the rumors and, of course, the bias that fake news was creating at the time, we discussed the greater impact of the Danites stealing a convoy of 45 guns and taking 3 men prisoner. In response to this, Dr. W.W. Austin's troops, who were initially en route to DeWitt, turned around and made their way back to Diamond to lay siege to the Mormon settlement. General Donovan arrived just in the nick of time before a fight broke out, and he camped with his troops in no man's land between the fortified Diamond and Austin's troops to try and stifle the conflict. The Mormons negotiated terms to buy out all of the non-Mormons living in Daviess County, and in return, Austin's troops made their way back to DeWitt and laid proper siege until the Mormons there surrendered and moved back to Caldwell or Daviess County. During all of these times of combative frustration between the Mormon leadership and the anti-Mormon mobs, the people that suffered were the everyday Mormon or Missourian with very little personal stake in this conflict. Mormons were starving and sick children were dying from exposure after being forced from their homes. Joe had to do something to keep his flock alive through the impending Missouri winter. We finished out the episode discussing Joe, Mo, and one of my favorite metal bands, Aversion's Crown, all of which are seekers of truth who began as prophets and slowly evolved into military leaders, closely mingling religious and secular authority. It all spawned from a quote Joe gave, claiming that he would be a second Muhammad to this generation. We'll discuss that in a minute, but that does it for the milk of today's episode. Let's get into the meat. Finally, when we left off, Joe and friends, they were looking for some possible way to save the Mormons from the winter that lay ahead. And once DeWitt was taken over, the Mormons realized that no matter who was right or wrong in the situation, regardless of who had the high ground, they were the outsiders to the Missourians. And there was simply no way they could legally win the war. So Joe chose to act extra-legally, in a warlike way to keep his flock alive. Beginning with October 15th, 1838, he called upon the Danites and the army of Israel. Now, there's some dispute over whether those terms were synonymous, but essentially any Mormon man they could arm was called upon to gather at Diamond to prepare for battle. This is when the weather begins to have a bit of an impact. Now, the small digression here. The plains of Russia during winter were known to the German soldiers as General Winter or General Frost. The weather can drastically change tactics or put entire strategies on hold for periods of time. This time approaching late October 1838, General Winter began to play a few cards into the Mormon-Missouri war game. The Mormons were planning their march, but were snowed in for 2 days before they could begin the offensive, of course, running dangerously low on resources. Now, I'm going to read this time frame out of the history of the church to see how it was recorded and subsequently read by believing Mormons for over a century and a half. I'm reading this out of a 1948 publication, volume 3, page 162. Quote, Monday, October 15th. The brethren assembled on the public square of Far West and formed a company of about 100 who took up a line of march of Adamon Diamond. Here let it be distinctly understood that this company were militia of the county of Caldwell acting under Lieutenant George M. Hinkle. All right, I got to pause for a second because Hinkle was a state-employed militia officer, but he wasn't working under the direction of any state militia officers, any of the other generals. He was strictly under the orders of Joseph Smith here. So the militia itself was not state-sanctioned. Now, that's a very important distinction and a noteworthy distortion of the truth that's included in the history of the church. Continuing on here, acting under George Hinkle, agreeable to the order of Doniphan, and the brethren were very careful in all their movements to act in strict accordance with the constitutional laws of the land. That's kind of a fishy phrase, but we're just moving on. The special object of this march was to protect Adamant-Diamond and repel the attacks of the mob in Daviess County. Having some property in that county and having a house building there, I went up at the same time. That's Joseph Smith. Everything in the history of the church is I. It's from like Joseph's first person perspective, even though the vast majority of the accounts that it was constructed from were recounted by other people and didn't say I. Anyway, while I was there, a number of houses belonging to our people were burned by the mob, who committed many other depredations, such as driving off horses, sheep, cattle, hogs, etc. A number of those whose houses were burned down, as well as those who lived in scattered and lonely situations, fled into the town for safety and for shelter from the inclemency of the weather, as a considerable snowstorm took place on the 17th and 18th, end quote. So things were not getting any better as the Mormons were being chased from their homes, and this reinforcement squad of 100 to 150 armed men marched to Diamond. Going back to the history of the church, quote, women and children, some in the most delicate condition, were thus obliged to leave their homes and travel several miles in order to effect the escape. My feelings were such as I cannot describe when I saw them flock into the village, almost entirely destitute of clothes and only escaping with their lives. During this state of affairs, General Parks arrived in Daviess County and was at the house of Colonel Lyman White on the 18th, when the intelligence was brought that the mob were burning houses, and also when women and children were fleeing for safety, among whom was Agnes M. Smith, wife of my brother Don Carlos Smith, who was absent on a mission in Tennessee. Her house had been plundered and burned by the mob, and she had traveled nearly 3 miles, carrying her 2 helpless babes, and had to wade the Grand River. End quote. I mean, do you see how desperate things are getting? And they're only going to get worse. These people that are camped out in makeshift tents and living in these horrible situations that are not considered permanent homes, they're going to freeze and starve to death over winter. This is very important. Continuing on through the history of the church, quote, Colonel White, who held a commission in the 59 Regiment under his command, meaning Parks, asked what was to be done. Parks told him that he must immediately call out his men and go and put the mob down. Accordingly, a force was immediately raised for the purpose of quelling the mob, and in a short time was on its march, with a determination to disperse the mob or die in the attempt, as the people could bear such treatment as was being inflicted upon them no longer. The mob, having learned of the orders of General Parks, and likewise being aware of the determination of the oppressed, broke up their encampment and fled. The mob, seeing that they could not succeed by force, now resorted to stratagem, and after removing their property out of their houses, which were nothing but log cabins, they fired them, and reported to the authorities of the state that the Mormons were burning and destroying all before them. End quote. Okay, this is from the history of the church, and this is how faithful Mormons today might read it. There were a few factual inaccuracies throughout the passage, but the largest and most glaring problem was Joe laying it all on General Parks. Now, Parks was friendly to the Mormons, similar in attitude to Generals Atchison and Doniphan, but he had absolutely no part in the Mormon looting. That was all done under the leadership of the Danites, which all stemmed from the commands issued by the commander-in-chief, who was Joe. Now, we're going to read a letter from General Parks here, so we understand the man behind the name a little bit. And it was written in 1839 from Parks to a Mormon named James Sloan in Quincy, Illinois. We'll get to that in a second, but we have to deal with the claim said in the history of the church that the mobs were fleeing from the Mormons and they were taking all of their shit out of their cabins and running away with them and setting fire to their cabins before they ran away. That absolutely makes no sense. Well, and then claiming, of course, that the Mormons were burning and destroying all before them. That's absolutely, completely inaccurate. Given the historical record that we know, that's just simply not how it works. And can you picture yourself ever getting to a point where that is your stratagem? Where you run away from an impending fight from a Mormon mob, a group of religious zealots armed and ready to fight. Your stratagem is running away and setting fire to your own home? I'm sorry, that's simply absurd. And of course, given the fact that when Far West and Diamond surrendered, there were huge stores of food and goods and staples found that didn't belong to the Mormons, that they were sustaining themselves off of. They had to get it from somewhere. I mean, the people living in these towns that the Mormons looted and pillaged, did they just, grab all of their stuff and run away, set fire to their cabins, and then, run to Far West or to Diamond and drop off their stuff and then run away? How did that stuff get from the possession of the towns that the Mormons were looting and pillaging into the possession of the bishop's storehouse, given the claim that these people were setting fire to their own cabins? It's patently absurd. So that is how Mormons today read that out of the history of the church. That's how it's recounted, and it's simply inaccurate. But of course, to kind of get back into this discussion here, let's read that letter from Hiram Parks, General Hiram Parks, to James Sloan in Illinois. It enlightens us as to his personality a bit. It kind of gives us a little snapshot into the human element here. This is hosted on MormonHistoricSites.org, and there will be a link for it in the show notes. Quote, "Dear Sir, I've received 2 letters from you since I last saw you on the subject of your gun, but have delayed answering them until I could learn of the governor what disposition he would make of the guns surrendered by your people." Of course, this was addressed to James Sloan in Quincy, Illinois, after the surrender of Far West and Diamond. This was in 1839, nearly a year after what we're talking about here. James Sloan was still trying to get his gun that he had surrendered during the surrender of the 2 cities. It continues, "Shortly after the rise of the General Assembly last spring, he," meaning the governor, "directed his aide-camp, Mr. W.C. Williams, of this place to let the Mormons have their guns, by swearing to them, besides doing this, that they had to pay the Justice of the Peace his fees, and Mr. Williams 50 cents on each gun for his trouble of handing them out, to this rule of his I have demonstrated time after time, but all to no purpose. I have no doubt that your gun is here, but it cannot be drawn unless you swear here or someone for you to prove the gun was the gun that was surrendered to me at Adam on Diamond, which I delivered to Major General John B. Clark at Far West, who had the command of all the military forces at the time." So he's saying, I can get you your gun back, but you have to pay Mr. W.C. Williams the 50-cent handling fee of taking those surrendered arms, and you have to prove which gun is actually yours, because, there's 500 armed men at Far West when they surrendered. We took a lot of guns from you guys. We have to know which one was yours. So it's this big fustercluck of confusion trying to get the possession of the Mormons after surrender back into the rightful hands of their owners. It continues on. "I am very sorry for such a state of things to exist in the state in which I live, but it is not less true that the governor has wholly disregarded the treaty made with your people, and by the officers commanding the forces sent against you at that time. I have written to the governor," this is Governor Boggs, of course, "a few days ago in relation to what he intends to do in relation to the balance of the guns yet at this place. And so, as soon as I receive an answer from him, I will write to you, and if I can be of any service to you in processing your gun, I will certainly do so. I would be glad to hear how your family are, and how they are satisfied with their new home. And this is where I think we get into the human element, because this whole time it's between two friends trying to get Sloane's gun back to him. But this is where I think we can kind of see that General Parks might have had feelings for Sloane's daughter. And this is what we're basing that off of. Tell Mary Jane that I would be glad if she would send that cow and calf I own of hers. Tell her to write to me and let me know how she is doing, and if she is married or expects to be in a short time. Tell Mrs. Sloane that I would be glad to see her write to me on the receipt of this. Give my respects to all my inquiring friends, and accept for yourself my best wishes for your future welfare. I am yours respectfully, H.G. Parks. End quote. It kind of offers a window into this human experience behind these fighting groups of men, right? You have this guy, General Parks, who was essentially friendly to the Mormons, having a letter exchange with James Sloane, a faithful Mormon, after the surrender here. And he's working with the governor and the Major Williams, to try and get their guns back, to try and instill order and peace. Because even though Joe and Rigdon and people were in jail, the tensions that had built up over a long time weren't immediately dispelled. So, I just love seeing letter exchanges like this, where we can actually peek into the human condition. We can see that it was actually people that went through this. We're going to be relying heavily on these first-person accounts and letter exchanges over the next few episodes, because the human element is something that oftentimes gets lost in the confusion here. But let's jump off of that letter and let's go back into the history of the church, volume 3, and let it continue our progression a little bit here. Quote, as I was driven away from Kirtland without the privilege of settling my business, I had previous to this employed Colonel Oliver Granger as my agent to close all my affairs in the East, and as I have been accused of running away, cheating my creditors, etc., I will insert one of the many cards and letters I have received from gentlemen who have had the best opportunity of knowing my business transactions and whose testimony comes unsolicited. Now, what we're about to read is a card that... Okay, in the 1830s, Experian and TransUnion and the credit reporting agencies weren't a thing, okay? People didn't have established credit that was kept in this international database of names and credit scores. Your credit was as good as what other people would give you, essentially. Your word was your bond, and Joseph had violated his word so many times. So what he would do anytime that he would come under scrutiny about his word or his business practices, or when somebody has accused him of, quote, running away, cheating my creditors, etc., end quote, he would include a card from these people saying that, hey, Joe's actually a pretty cool guy, and we believe that he's all right. So this is the card that he would include in situations like this. It was sent Painesville, October 19th, 1838. Quote, we, the undersigned, being personal acquaintances of Oliver Granger, firmly believe that the course which he had pursued in settling the claims, account, etc., against the former citizens of Kirtland Township has done much credit to himself and all others that committed to him the care of adjusting their business with this community, which also furnishes evidence that there was no intention on their part of defrauding the creditors. And of course, it was signed by Thomas Griffith and John Seymour, two faithful Mormons living in Kirtland. This is Joe's response when people claim that he was an asshole or, just doing really shitty business practices. Okay, he would include a card that says, no, Joe's a really cool guy. That's what we're talking about here. And it claims that he did what was right in Kirtland, where he has done much credit to himself and all others that committed to him care of adjusting their business with the community. No, he didn't. He ran away from Kirtland. That's why he left in the middle of the night. That's why Rigdon left in the middle of the night, and Brigham Young had left a few weeks earlier than that, and Oliver Cowdery was spending time in Missouri. They were all under scrutiny from the law. They were all in violation of business practices. They were all tens of thousands of dollars in debt, of personal debt, because they hadn't been incorporated as the church, the Church of Christ at this time. And this is Joe's answer. Here's a card from these people, these random people, saying that I did the right thing and that I didn't run away from my obligations. It's not how business can be done. And it just shows the susceptibility of the 1830s business system to fraudsters, right? To people like Joseph, who are just on the lookout for themselves, will do anything to get ahead in the world. And it shouldn't, I guess I shouldn't apply it to just the 19th century, right? It happens today. Hey, my friend wants to start up a contracting company or a mechanics shop, right? Oh, well, that sounds cool. Has he done so successfully in the past? Oh, yeah, totally. Here's a card from a couple of his friends saying that he's been a good business partner in the past. And it's patently absurd. It doesn't, it happens all day, every day. We are all suckers to somebody like that. But given Joe's just terrible business practices, combined with the persecution narrative, the rhetorical bullshit that was constantly exploding from the pulpit, Joe was obliged to take action here. Okay, we read a small excerpt from this quote last episode to finish out the show, and that's what kind of got us into the discussion about Joe and Muhammad. But let's read the entire Thomas B. Marsh affidavit, and let's put that second Muhammad quote into proper context. This is Thomas B. Marsh's affidavit. Quote, "They have among them a company considered true Mormons called the Danites, who have taken an oath to support the heads of the church in all things that they say or do, whether right or wrong. Many, however, of this band are much dissatisfied with this oath, as being against moral and religious practices. On Saturday last, I am informed by the Mormons that they had a meeting at Far West, at which they appointed a company of 12 by the name of the Destruction Company, for the purpose of burning and destroying. And if the people of Clay and Ray made any movement against them, this destroying company were to burn liberty in Richmond. The prophet inculcates the notion, and it is believed by every true Mormon, that Smith's prophecies are superior to the laws of the land." That's really scary, isn't it? When the followers of a religious leader believe that he is speaking above the laws of the land. This is what happens when people get to that point. "I have heard the prophet say that he would yet tread down his enemies and walk over their dead bodies. And if he was not let alone, he would become a second Muhammad to this generation." There's that quote. Now let's put that further into context. "And that he would make it one gore of blood from the Rocky Mountains to the Atlantic Ocean. That, like Muhammad, whose motto in treating for peace was the Al-Quran or the sword, so should it eventually be with us, Joseph Smith or the sword. The number of armed men at Adam-on-Diamond was between 300 and 400. Signed, Thomas B. Marsh." End quote. That was the entirety of the quote that we just read a small excerpt from at the end of the last historical episode. To solve this refugee crisis on Joe's hands, he decided to become that second Muhammad. Apostle David W. Patton, also known as Captain Fearnought to the men that he led, organized an army of 150 men, and they rode into the small town of Gallatin, where the election battle had occurred 2 months prior to this. Now, the majority of the men in this town were in the town saloon at the time, and when they saw the Mormons cresting the horizon en masse, they knew what was happening, and they ran for their lives. Now, of course, elsewhere, General Lyman White organized 80 armed men together, declaring, Quote, "It would be only a breakfast spell to whip the Missourians. Many of them will be drunk, and if they come against us, we will hew them down like old stumps." End quote. So he took those 80 men and rode them to Millport. When they arrived, the town was essentially empty because, well, of course, the Mormons had made an agreement with the non-Mormons in Daviess County to buy them out of their land. But the violence, of course, had also been enough to this point that any remaining non-Mormon living in Daviess County had pretty much fled. It was sparsely populated at this point by non-Mormons. So Millport was basically a ghost town when General White and his men arrived. Then Captain Fearnought and General White had orders that would serve to be the downfall of the Mormons and cause them to lose 17 of their brothers in just a week's time. They looted everything in these towns and burned them to the ground. They chased the few remaining people from their homes in, half a foot of snow. They piled all of the looted possessions into the middle of town and then burned all of the structures around before they loaded everything up that they could carry and took it back to the bishop's storehouse in Diamond or Far West. This was all premeditated. They had a plan. And to illustrate that, a man named Jacob Stallings owned a small merchant store in Gallatin. And when Captain Fearnought chased Stallings out of his merchant store, I'm just going to read from the 1838 Mormon War in Missouri by Stephen Lesur to describe the situation. This is page 119. Quote, "Some of the Missourians who were threatened or had their homes plundered and burned were actually friends of the Mormons. Jacob Stallings, a Gallatin merchant, had sold goods to the saints on credit to be paid for when their crops were harvested. When Captain Patton's company attacked Gallatin, they plundered and burned Stallings' store and confiscated his receipt books, which he never recovered." End quote. Now, if you're literally stealing the receipt books from somebody you owe a lot of money to, that's malicious and premeditated. But Benjamin Franklin Johnson, who we've relied upon for his first account many times in the past, described this well. And this is taken from page 42 of his personal history. It's linked in the show notes. Quote, "Here, let me say that it should not be supposed, though we were sought to repel mob violence and were compelled to forage for food when hemmed in on all sides by a mob who had driven us from homes that they had sold to us and been paid for, robbing us of everything but our lives and the little we could carry away, leaving our crops, stock, and household goods to our enemies, that we were common robbers, because we took by reprisal that with which to keep from starvation our women and children. Ours was a struggle for our lives and homes, and a more conscientious, noble, and patriotic spirit never enthused man than that which animated our leaders in this just defense of our rights." End quote. A struggle for our lives and homes to keep our women and children from starvation. This is the harsh reality that underlies this entire conflict. This is the human element we need to focus on. I'm going to quote from earlier in Johnson's autobiography. Quote, "Coming one morning, just at daylight from off picket duty, I saw a squad of brethren, among whom was my then intimate friend and bosom companion, W.D. Huntington, brother of Sister Zina D. Huntington, who was one of Joseph's wives. And I asked where they were going, but he only took time to say, 'Come and see.' So, without food, other than a piece of corn cake or dodger, as it was then termed, and after an all-night guard and fast, I started upon a 2-year-old colt, which by some circumstances I had got astride of, and fell into rank with a company of near 20 mounted men, with Cornelius P. Lott as our captain." So, of course, setting this up for us, Benjamin Johnson here was on night guard duty, and he was starving. All that he had with him was a little piece of corn cake, or dodger, as they called it, and he was, hungry, and saw this group of soldiers headed somewhere. He's like, "Where are you guys going?" They said, "Just come and see. Why don't you find out?" He continues, "I soon learned our destination was to Taylor's on Grand River, about 9 miles above, where it was said arms and ammunition were held for the use of the mob. On arriving opposite the houses, which were on the riverbank, we saw a commotion, and persons stepped back into the cornfield which was close by. We hastily crossed the river, surrounded the house, and myself with others went for those who had fled. One man I saw and followed, and as he dodged behind a large oak stub, Alex Williams came on one side, and as I came on the other. Thus we caught him. It was the first prisoner I had ever assisted to take, and I learned something of the influence of fear upon the human heart. This is horrible. For as we put our hands upon his shoulders, there was such a look of expectant death, and such begging for his life, and then to see a fine-looking married man so filled to fear that as he sank upon the ground, his bowels seemed to pour all their contents into his linen pantaloons and into his sockless shoes. Benjamin Johnson is telling us that they took a prisoner and literally scared the shit out of this man. That's what we're talking about here. But of course, Johnson's account continues, and it's just amazing. We're going to keep reading here. This was one of the tailors to whom, again, I may refer. Now, this is important. Keep that tailor's name in mind, because what happens to Benjamin Johnson in another couple of episodes is contingent upon him taking this guy as prisoner here. It continues, but we calmed his fears, told him for what purpose we had come, and that if there really were no arms or ammunition stored there to be used against us, we should leave them as we have found them. But if we found they had those things, we would burn them out. There were 2 men with a number of women and children, and all affirmed that there was nothing of the kind there. Now what they're talking about are the tailors hiding guns for the Missouri militia that were going to be used against the Mormons. That seems like a relevant question, right? After a thorough search of houses, barns, etc., our captain ordered a search in the cornfields to hunt the corn shocks, which soon resulted in the discovery of arms and ammunition and of their falsehoods. Oh, so the tailors lied to them about harboring arms and ammunition. The females hastily took from the houses what they could carry, and here I might say that there was almost a trial of my faith in my pity for our enemies, even those who were plotting our destruction. Now, this is where I think the person behind Benjamin Franklin Johnson starts to really come out here. Among the women was one young, married, and apparently near her confinement, and another with small children and not a wagon, and many miles away from any of their friends, and snow had begun already in October to fall. My sympathies were drawn toward the women and children, but I would in no degree let them deter me from duty. So while the others were pillaging for something to carry away, I was doing my best to protect, as far as possible, the lives and comfort of the families who were dependent on getting away upon horseback. When the horses were brought up for their use, there was one animal with a side saddle on which the young woman was to get away. But it was taken away by one Sloan. There's that Sloan James Sloan guy that we're talking about, had the letter exchange with General Parks earlier, who had kept the boarding house where I stayed, a man of education and apparently a gentleman. It was too much for me. The Mormons were essentially commanded by this leader, if you find any arms or ammunition, take them and loot the people's houses and burn their house to the ground. But of course, there's women and children here, and they're miles away from any of their friends, and the snow is flying. What are you going to do? Just send them on their way and hope they get home safely? They get somewhere where they can survive, or, just not care? It shows that Benjamin Johnson was just, his humanity is overpowering the commands that he's following from these horrible, deplorable individuals commanding such disgusting things. He goes on to say, "It was too much for me. So I took the animal away from him by force and put her upon it, and then got from another roll of homemade cloth and fastened it on behind her. While the others were doing the burning and plunder, my mission was of mercy, so far as duty would permit." So Benjamin Johnson grabbed a horse out of the contingency for her, or for these women, put a cloth over them so that they would not freeze out in the few miles they had to go till they could get to a friend's house, and sent them on their way. But of course I made enemies at home, and became more known by those who are our avowed enemies. Before noon we had set all on fire, and left upon a circuitous route towards home. And yet I had had nothing to eat, and was much in need of food. And before starting, went to a beehive, and took in the hollow of a half pumpkin some beautiful white comb honey. Ate a little as I went, looked at it, and wished I might eat more, but as I could not, I set it upon a stump, where I have many times thought of it through the 56 years that have since passed. End quote. This perfectly encapsulates the entire human existence that was involved here. Benjamin Johnson was a good guy. He was born in 1818. At this time, he was, not even in his 20s yet. He's a teenager. These men were assaulting this small household with men, women, and children, and a pregnant woman, looking for arms, and they found them. And they said, if we find them, we're going to burn your house down. Simple as that. And they found them, and they burned the house down. But Benjamin Johnson had the empathy and the compassion to steal a horse for them, and put them on the horse, and send them on their way with a blanket, so that they could survive. And this whole time, he had spent the whole night before fasting and on guard. And he hadn't had anything to eat for this whole day. And by noon, he was so hungry that he went and ripped open a beehive and took half of it out and was eating just raw honey. When your body is that starved for resources, just eating pure sugar isn't very substantial. But he, being as hungry as he couldn't eat any more of the pure sugar and just put it on a stump. And, quote, where I have many times thought of it through the 56 years that have since passed, end quote. So much humanity encapsulated in one passage. It's so incredible. But after Captain Fearnought and General White's troops returned to the Bishop's storehouse in Diamond and Far West with their mountain of goods heaped on each horse's back, a man named Seymour Brunson led a troop of 100 armed men to a small town called Grindstone, where there was rumor of Colonel Neil Gilliam, a vicious anti-Mormon, gathering an armed force of vigilantes to stop the Mormon conquest. So Brunson's army met with no opposition that day, but they looted and burned every single home from Diamond to Grindstone. Now Jonathan Dunham, another group, led a company of 50 men to the outer lying countryside and looted every building they could possibly find, including taking a few prisoners. This is a quote from the 1838 Mormon War in Missouri. Quote, at the end of the day, these companies returned to Diamond with cattle, hogs, and an abundance of property, but they had encountered no enemy troops. End quote. And thus ended the Mormon conquest of Daviess County of October 18th, 1838. This had many profound effects. First, it showed the Missourians that the Mormons were finally going to make good on the rhetoric they'd been spewing from the pulpit for months now. If they were claiming a war of extermination and saying that they wouldn't deal with the Missourian aggression, this was proof. They went out on this conquest with the resolve to destroy any militia or mob they came against, and luckily for everybody, the groups didn't meet. But they had the motivation and solidarity to act aggressively as an army, raiding and pillaging, living off the spoils of war. The problem the Mormons had of starvation was no longer an issue. They had an abundance of resources in their bishop's storehouse now. But last episode, I said that Joe had two problems on his hands, right? The Mormons were either going to die A, from starvation, or die B, from too much lead ripping holes in their bodies. He dealt with the first problem first, as it was a more pressing issue. People were dying from exposure and lack of resources. So Joe took care of that problem first before the second problem became an inevitability. Unfortunately for all, this raiding solution vastly contributed to the second problem, metastasizing. As each of these places in Daviess County were raided and the people were chased out, those people had to go somewhere, right? The Mormons didn't just kill them off, which would have been much worse, but they had to go somewhere, and most of them just spread out to non-Mormon safe havens in nearby Clay and Ray and Liberty and Saline and Carroll counties. And as these people were trickling into local Missourian towns, they were relaying to all of the non-Mormon Missourians, many of which hated the Mormons, stories of what they'd just experienced. And as is typical for this entire few months of Mormon history, rumors spreading contributed to the problem and effectively burned any bridges the Mormons had with any non-Mormon allies. Now, Boggs and the Missouri government in Richmond and Ray County were absolutely flooded with reports of Mormon aggression in Daviess County. This was activity on a whole new level, and the government needed to act appropriately in response. The first thing Boggs did was to fire Major General David R. Atchison and promote John B. Clark to Atchison's position of Major General of the Missouri Militia. Now, Atchison, who was the highest-ranking field officer in Missouri, Major General, had been unsuccessful in quelling the Mormon insurrection in Boggs' mind. The argument could be made that he did a lot to keep the conflict from escalating many, many times, and Boggs owes a lot to Atchison for things not spiraling out of control sooner than they did. But Boggs figured that Atchison had not been successful, and therefore he needed to remove him. So he put somebody into Atchison's position that was less sympathetic to the Mormons. And of the many interactions we have on record between Boggs and Atchison, I personally think this was the worst thing that Boggs could have done. Atchison was one of the few people in the middle of this situation, right smack dab in the middle, and he understood what was going on, and he had rightfully claimed multiple times that the Mormons were acting on the defensive for this entire conflict up to this point. Now, another underlying theme in these letter exchanges was Atchison constantly pleading for Boggs to make a personal appearance. And Atchison wasn't the only one pleading for a personal intervention from Boggs. Brigadier General Hiram Parks, who we read from earlier, asked for the same thing many times, saying things like, quote, "He need not order out any forces, those already ordered by me I deem sufficient. You know a word from His Excellency would have more power to quell this affair than a regiment," end quote. And that's taken from the November court documents. I mean, Atchison being removed from the case left a large workload to fall on the shoulders of Generals Doniphan and Parks, who were the two non-Mormon friendly state militiamen, who, they were friendly to the Mormons. But then it also fell onto Generals Clark and Lucas, as well as Captain Bogart and Colonel Neil Gilliam, all four of which hated the Mormons. So when Boggs removed Atchison from the case, the Mormons lost their primary ally in the fight. Now, Atchison would still stick around and continue correspondence, probably just out of the altruism in his heart, because he was a good goddamn guy. But he was officially removed from being head general and highest-ranking field officer over the case, making way for anti-Mormon militia leaders to fill his position. Now, Governor Lilburn Boggs, of course, was just flooded over the next week with more reports of Mormon depredations in Daviess County, many of which were unfounded rumors talking about how many people the Mormons had killed. There's no evidence that the Mormons killed anybody in these raiding. They just chased them from their homes, stole their property, and burned their homes down. But Boggs knew that the Mormons were plutonium to any political career. Nobody could safely touch them and come away unscathed. Even Martin Van Buren realized this in the following years when Joe met with him to ask for reconciliation in Missouri. Van Buren essentially turned Joe away, saying that he can't take sides with the Mormons. Of course, Generals Atchison and Doniphan, who were friendly to the Mormons throughout this conflict, would go on after it and have very successful political careers. But when the Mormons performed their conquest, even Generals Atchison and Donovan said that the Mormons were fanatics that needed to be put down. So there's no way you could do anything favorable to the Mormons and still stay on everybody else's, the non-Mormons, good side. But Boggs' refusal to appear in person truly may have cost many people their lives. Okay? He had been responsible for calling together militias and immediately disbanding them upon receiving new intel more than once. That had happened like 3 times by this point. You know why those costly and ridiculous situations happened? Because Boggs would hear rumor that the Mormons were acting aggressively and then call together a militia to quell the problems. A few days later, some trusted individuals as part of a, quote, investigative committee, end quote, would return to his office with reports that the Mormons were acting defensively, and there was no need for the militia to answer to Mormon military actions. Now, it wasn't hard for these committees to ascertain the truth when they personally went to Daviess and Caldwell counties and examined the situations. And Boggs simply needed to do the same to allay his own apprehensions and rid himself of confusion with the whole Mormon situation. When Boggs began his career back in 1832, he was friendly to the Mormons. Now he couldn't be trusted because he only seemed to take actions against them. And when it came to doing anything on behalf of the Mormons, Boggs simply couldn't be bothered. There is no question in my mind that if somebody more qualified and active in the conflict were actually governor in this situation, like, let's say, just General Atchison, for example, the Battle of Crooked River never would have happened, nor would have the extermination order or the Hauntsville massacre. One person in an important position with a slightly increased amount of give a fuck, and this whole story would have been a non-issue in American history. But let's look at the other side of the equation, right? That's the Missouri government side. Let's look at the Mormon government, Joe, Hiram, and Rigdon. All right, the leadership of the church and the Mormon militias. Now, I'm just going to refer to them royally as Joe because when it all came down to it, he was the prophet. He was calling the final shots in all these situations. So Rigdon and Hiram were merely his counselors through it all. But they stood in solidarity and as a united front as leaders of these Mormon mobs. The Missourian mobocrats, as Joe called them, had done everything possible in their power to fuck with the Mormons. No matter what the situation, whether it was inflating the cost of a bushel of corn by 300%, or refusing to let the Mormons use the mill at Grindstone to grind their wheat, or it was surrounding their towns and running military drills outside of the Mormon towns, all while being supplied by the local non-Mormon population and starving the Mormons by sieging their town. Maybe it was refusing to buy goods just because they're being sold by a Mormon, or barring their right to vote and inciting a brawl during a hotly contested election. Most of all, chasing the Mormons out of their homes simply because they do not belong there. The Missourians were just assholes to the Mormons. Now that last one is crucial. So much of the pressure all boils down to who has the right to what land. Mormons had the right to settle on any property they pleased as long as it was acquired through legal means. That's the case for everybody in America, okay? You get some land for yourself, you get the right to live there, and nobody has the right to remove you from your property. Unfortunately, well, unless it's eminent domain, which that's a whole other thing I'm not going to talk about. Unfortunately, things weren't so cut and dried in the 1830s in Missouri. The Mormons had acquired most of their land through legal means, but they weren't able to pay for it. The majority of the people chasing the Mormons out of their homes weren't the rightful landowners. You know, they weren't legally evicting them given the Mormons defaulting on their loans. They just knew that the Mormons weren't paying for what they were using and saw it as their right to remove the Mormons and allow somebody to settle the land that would pay for it. Now, this is often sold as religious persecution, ignorantly simplifying away so much nuance. Nuance which really helps to explain the real issues here. But we can't forget the human element, okay? These were humans dealing with all of these situations that we find ourselves studying here. And that's one thing that we can't lose sight of. Now, I'm going to read a little bit more from Benjamin F. Johnson's autobiography here, because it's amazing. It really shows more of the human element here. He says, quote, "On our way home," this is after the day of looting, October 18th, "our company divided to scout in different directions, and we soon came upon a fine-looking band of horses following a broodmare with a bell." So if there's a bunch of horses following a broodmare that has a bell on his neck, he's obviously owned by somebody. The whole brood is owned by somebody, right? Continues, "As I was upon this 2-year-old colt and wished one for heavier service, I thought it a good time to make a trial to get one." So Johnson here says, this 2-year-old colt that I have, he's kind of a pain in the ass. So I'm going to, there's some really nice horses over there. I'm going to go appropriate one for myself. Here we go. "So as a comrade offered to take my gun and lead my animal by the halter, I took the bridle and started with 2 others who volunteered to go with me for the same purpose. It was now in the afternoon and clouds were rising as though it would rain. But we pushed with hope and earnestness for our animals, who, like the will-o'-the-wisp, were always just ahead but never to be overtaken and caught." Okay, I don't know if any of you have ever had to chase horses before, but if they get out of their pen and they are able to just walk and you have to chase them down, a horse will outwalk you, okay? You will walk for miles and miles and miles, and the horse will just keep walking, a few hundred yards in front of you, always looking back and seeing where you are. But when a horse gets out and can just wander around, there's nothing stopping it from outwalking you. That's what we're seeing here. These guys saw this group of horses, and they were like, "We really want those. Here, take my horse for me. Take my gun. We're going to go capture these horses." And they started chasing them in the afternoon. And by the evening, they couldn't track them anymore. The horses had outwalked these men. That's going to happen every time you try and track down a horse, until you go back to camp and get a car or another horse or something to go chase them down. That's just how it works. So it continues here. "Yet we followed until it began to rain, and then we lost the track of our party and were lost. As it grew dusk, we hastened, but failed to find our way or our trail." So they wanted to steal these horses, and they got lost. "After dark, we struck a trail, which we followed for miles, nearing a large body of timber. And knowing that there was a mob gathering on what was called the grindstone, and fearing we were going in that direction, we halted. As one of our party had a flintlock musket, we managed by care to get a light started with us in the trail we were following, and soon discovered that our party had not passed that way. So now it's nightfall, it's raining out there. Only one of them has a gun, and they were able to strike up a small fire to see exactly where they are. But they're like, I don't recognize anything. Our party hasn't passed this way. If we keep walking, we're going to get to Grindstone where that anti-Mormon mob is gathering, and they're going to kill us, so we're screwed. And of course, they just go navigating through the night. Continues, I felt sure we were going in the wrong direction and said we must take another direction. I extinguished the fire, and as I did so, and we turned our course, we heard but a few rods behind us a party of horsemen who galloped off another direction, which proved we were near the mob encampment, near Grindstone, I would assume, or that's what they thought. We found and followed another trail until near midnight. I just use Google Maps, guys. And I became so weary and faint through the want of sleep and food. I felt I should soon be compelled to stop. No, this guy has had nothing to eat but a little bit of corn cake and some honey. For the last 24 hours, that's all he's had to eat. And he's been marching around all day, looting and pillaging places. Now he doesn't have anything. We were in some creek bottom among the timber, and soon came to a clearing with a number of houses. There being no moon and cloudy, it was very dark, and their outlines could barely be discerned. We drew near with great caution, and seeing no evidence of life, I determined to ascertain if anyone was there. And if so, to learn if we could get food and a chance to rest. I know that all the Mormons are burning and looting and pillaging everybody in the county, but can we come in for a night? It's cool. I told my companions, if anything befell me, to come to the rescue or go and report. Well, that's fair, right? I knocked at the first house, but no answer. I mean, this guy, he's a teenager. This is a courageous teenager, right? Went to the next with the same result, and finding the third to be a barn, I returned to the first and called my companions. We found doors and windows barred, but forced an entrance through a window. The first step after reaching the floor, I fell headlong into a cellar under the floor, where a part of what were called puncheons had been pulled up, with which to brace windows and doors. So the first step he took into this house, after breaking in through a window, he fell down into the cellar where there were a bunch of boards and stuff that they were using to fortify the windows and doors. I got out of the cellar, called my companions to bring their guns, by means of which we soon succeeded in making a fire. On lighting up, we found some family had apparently just left, as nearly everything but beds, clothing, and food was present. I soon had a fire, and on a pile of deerskins made me a bed, telling my companions that I could not watch. Yeah, because he had just done a midnight watch the day before. And that we should perhaps be discovered before morning. And so, wet, hungry, and tired, and more dead than alive, I fell asleep. I'd slept a couple of hours, when I was disturbed by some call that broke upon my dead asleep but waking senses. He was scared they'd be discovered by morning in this abandoned house. "Who is there?" was repeated again and again. More asleep than awake, I answered, "Me!" "What is your name?" came next. I said, "Benjamin F. Johnson." My name was passed around the house, and I knew we were surrounded. Directly, I heard one of the party say, "I know him," and he at once dismounted and came in. I saw it was Brother John Butler, whose acquaintance I had made in a snowstorm a few days before. When finding him, one of our most valiant men, with nothing but some green cowhide on his feet as moccasins, I gave him my only shoes that were of any value, and now, as by special providence, had upon my feet a most excellent pair of new calfskin boots, by which I felt I had been the greatest gainer. We told Brother Butler how we came there, and he said we were on the right road, but near 9 miles from home. So they were on the right road, walking the wrong direction, I would assume. He had been out on special commission and was riding the prophet's black horse. Charlie! There's good old Charlie coming back. That fat ass that was cracking through the ice. He told his companions to return to Diamond, and that he would remain with us, which he did. In the early morning, he led the way some miles, and half towards our enemy's camp, to the smoldering ruins of a house apparently burned the day before, to find something to eat. The only things to be found were a pile of onions and a flock of chickens, one of which we soon had boiling with onions in a stray dinner pot. So now they're resuming their day. So this October 18th and 19th were their days of plundering, essentially. Now, when Butler came by with his small group of Mormon militia and found Benjamin Johnson and his 2 friends sleeping in this abandoned home that had been abandoned by a non-Mormon family very recently, they're like, "Oh, good to see you. I'm so glad you're not an anti-Mormon vigilante, or else we'd be dead right now." So then they go out, and they're of course hungry. They have no food. They have nothing. And of course, nothing really was waiting back for them in Diamond, because that was 9 miles away. They were hungry. So all that they found were some onions and a flock of chickens, and they soon had a stew going. But then this is what happens after. "But we did not then, so near our enemies, feel great delicacy as to our cooking. For we were governed by the idea of eat to live. And we felt that the quicker we could eat our chicken and onions and get from there, the greater was our chance to live. Thus the onions were but half done, and the chicken none too tender." So they essentially stole the onions and chicken to eat for breakfast, and they realized, yes, somebody's going to come along and see that we stole these things. Let's cook this and eat it fast. And the stuff was only half cooked, which, I don't know, I guess immune systems back then were more powerful than they are nowadays. Close by was an old cowbell, and cattle scattered about on the prairie. So while we were getting our breakfast, which was not long, Brother Butler had taken a gourd shell with salt and commenced calling, "Sukbo, sukbos." I don't know what that is. The bell cow at once started for salt, with all the cattle after her, and soon he was ahead on old Charlie with a herd of cattle following, of course appropriating it for themselves. As it went by us, we fell in behind and followed to Diamond. When within a mile or two, we heard a firing of the cannon which had that night arrived, having been taken from the mob and rooted up by the old sow as related in history. That's talking about the cannon that the Mormons were able to appropriate from one of the armies that fled. Our animals, nearly 40 head of good beef cattle for our famishing people, was a godsend indeed, and so regarded by all. Yeah, this is the human element. This huge town of starving people, and in comes this band of robbers, Benjamin Johnson and John Butler and, a few other guys with this herd of 40 cattle. They needed that to survive. It's no wonder that they were rejoicing at this, because if not for those cattle, many people could have died. If not for all of the looting that the Mormons did, many people could die. And after that comes in the line, "We were not common robbers because we took by reprisal that with which to keep from starvation our women and children. Ours was a struggle for our lives and homes, and a more conscientious, noble, and patriotic spirit never enthused man than that which animated our leaders in this just defense of our rights." End quote. Over the next few historical episodes, we're going to be doing this a bit. We'll be reading large excerpts from journals and autobiographies, because these were the people that were actually there. And we have to try and ascertain what happened by reading these first-hand sources and then looking at the circumstantial evidence to try and build a narrative or some kind of historical theory that explains the sequence of events. When we talk about this militia chasing people from their homes, or another militia surrounding DeWitt or Diamond, those are just faceless gray masses of bodies, right? We don't really understand what it was like to be there, standing in the ranks, until we actually read the situation recounted through the eyes of people like Benjamin Johnson here. To kind of get meta on this here, it forces me to reflect on rights. Who had the right to do what they did? With how convoluted the historical record is for this time, it's hard to determine if or when any single group was in the right in doing what they did. Were the Mormons in the right removing all the citizens from Daviess County from their homes? Citizens who'd been living there decades before the Mormons moved in? Were the vigilante militias in the right in chasing the Mormons out of Carroll County only a week before? If it meant life or death, did the Mormons have a right to raid and steal food to fight off impending mass starvation? Did the Missourians have the right to chase Mormons off their land when they defaulted on their loans back in 1833? Essentially being the main causal factor in this whole 1838 conflict. Who had the right to do what they did? There's just no simple answer. No single group had the ethical high ground. Even if actions taken by the militia against the Mormons were legally sanctioned by the local government, it doesn't mean that they were actually right in doing so. I guess that's where the meaning of right, the word right, can broaden its scope a bit to include ethically right. With our expanded definition, who was really in the right in this whole situation? With a simple story, you have a protagonist, an antagonist, and a story arc, right? You have good guys and bad guys that are often fleshed out within the first few chapters or scenes, and then, of course, at the end of the 400 pages or the hour and a half, the protagonist's struggle reaches its crescendo and the story ends. Maybe this is why I don't like fictional stories very much and why I love studying history. Because it breaks all the conventions of what we call basic storytelling. Real life is far more complicated and beautiful than what a storyteller can illustrate for us in a given period of time through a given medium. And the story must go on. So next historical episode, we'll get into the Battle of Crooked River and Boggs' harsh reaction in response to the Mormon violence. As stated at the beginning of this episode, what you're about to listen to is part 2 of a discussion that I had with Brian and Sean of Mythicist Milwaukee last Sunday. Part 1 of the discussion, as I said, is up in their podcast feed, in the Mythicist Milwaukee feed, so be sure to follow the show notes to give it a listen, or just, search it on iTunes and Stitcher and all of the places that podcasts live and subscribe. It's Mythicist Milwaukee is a very well-produced podcast. It's been going for like 3.5, almost 4 years now. Also, I need to mention this. We took a 360 video of the interview. 360-degree video, so you can look around and stuff. Now, this is my first time using my new 360 camera for an interview type of thing, and I learned some things to do and not to do from it. So, it's not great. It's not perfect, but the video should be available for supporters of the show on patreon.com/nakedmormonism within the next 24 to 36 hours. In watching back, it feels like you're literally sitting in the room with us and just watching the conversation, and you have the ability to look around and pan from one person to the other, or if you don't want to stare at us, you can look out the window at the mall behind us. It's really cool. And it kind of opens up a lot of possibilities for these kind of interviews in the future. So I want to get your thoughts on the video. Maybe some ways that we can improve the experience for viewers. If you like these 360-degree interviews, let me know. We'll get to work on incorporating them into the show in any way possible. So, without further ado, this is the audio of the interview with Mythicist Milwaukee. Go to patreon.com/nakedmormonism to watch the 360 video feed. All right, we are joined here for part 2 of our discussion with Mythicist Milwaukee. If you want to listen to part 1, you got to go check out their Facebook feed, or Facebook or Twitter or podcast feed, whatever you want to call it.
iTunes, Stitcher, any of that stuff.
Right, or you can just be fantastic listeners, as I know you all are, and go pledge at their Patreon page, /Mythicist Milwaukee, I assume. And you can,
/Mythicist.
/Mythicist, all right, perfect. And you can watch the video, the 360 video. This is a podcasting first for both of us. We got a 360 video camera in there. So everybody that is watching, of course, say hi to Sean.
Hi, everyone.
And to Brian.
How are you doing?
Awesome. Well, thank you guys both for joining me, and I guess for sticking around an extra hour to talk more about Mormonism, because I feel like we just barely scratched the surface.
We can never get enough of Mormonism.
Right. and I was told, Bryce told me, this is the wave of the future.
Right.
This is the future of video.
Yeah, because
that's its prediction.
The listeners are sitting in the room with us right now.
Right.
They can look around. If they don't want to look at our faces, they can go look at the window outside at the mall and see what's going on out there.
See the deserted mall?
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Or they can, if they're audio geeks like I know Jason is here, they can look at this amazing Yamaha mixer here and this Zoom H5 that's sitting on the counter in front of us. I mean, this is the fully inclusive experience. So, because we are on Naked Mormonism here, let's get a little bit of background on what you guys do. Mythicist Milwaukee. I've been introduced to a couple of your videos on YouTube, but more importantly, I came to the Mythicist Milwaukee debate between Robert Price and Bart Ehrman, which was fantastic. So give us kind of a rundown, an elevator speech. What is Mythicist Milwaukee?
So, Mythicist Milwaukee, we started along the lines of just exploring what mythicism is, how all these current religions that we see as truth, how they actually originate in the older mythologies. So that's kind of how we started. We really got fascinated by, whether or not Jesus existed, where this concept of God comes from, the concept of angels, hell, all of these things that are supernatural. Where did this come from? And we started doing, small events in Milwaukee. Milwaukee is tough in the sense that we don't have a large secular community. And it's been a challenge for us. We've been around for a little over 3.5 years now, going on our 4th year. We just wanted to kind of see who the secular people were in Milwaukee. Is there support? What can we do to kind of flush that out a little bit? And so, we started doing conferences, smaller events. I've traveled around the world. I've been to Egypt, Greece, Kenya, Rwanda, just in doing my own firsthand research, going to Egypt, seeing the pyramids, going to Greece, seeing all of the temples, and kind of proving out that, the religions that we see today are only just newer stories of mythology that we see in antiquity. And, that's the way it's great. The Mormonism conversation, because very similar,
Oh, yeah. Well, and that was the question that I posed in the Q&A session or section of the debate. Was I went up there and I said, so I feel like that Saul of Tarsus and that Joseph Smith were real people.
Yeah.
Much in the way that the creators of Superman were real people. But I don't think that Superman, Jesus, and Angel Moroni were actually real people.
Right.
They're these evolved mythologies that people take from the culture around them, and then they appropriate it for themselves and call it their own,
right?
Or have some kind of divine experience, right?
Right, and but a lot of people don't know that, and how do you get the information out there? And we started doing the conferences. We're going to be in our 4th major conference this September 30th, 2017, where we've integrated a debate series, and we've also created a homegrown movie called Batman and Jesus,
which I saw the trailer for. It's amazing. I can't wait for it.
Yeah, we're really, again, taking the Batman figure, showing how his story has evolved over time, taking the Jesus figure, showing where that comes from, why it's there, how it evolves over time. So we have that coming up. We have a lot of things. We do the podcast, we do videos, we do events, we do local events. We're really there's a team of 14 to 16, in and out every Sunday, meeting up in Milwaukee, doing these initiatives, working on it, investing their own money. So it's a lot of hardworking, talented individuals to do a lot. It takes to do a lot of things we do.
Yeah, it's definitely. I think that the idea is to question the narrative that is. We talked about Jesus and Joseph Smith, but what about Abraham? What about Moses? Are those real people?
Right.
I mean, I highly doubt it. And when you see that repackaged, it's just important to check sources and to question the narrative and just really dig down.
Yeah, and one of the other things I wanted to mention before we moved on from this is one of the things I'm trying to do with our podcast. It's called the Mythicist Milwaukee Show. We've had guests on that talk about the mythicist position, about atheism, about secularism, but one of the things I'm trying to do now is connect us to more of the entertainment field. We had a chance to work with Eric Andre and Hannibal Buress last year.
Fantastic.
Two comedians. We actually got to go on tour with them. That opened up some connections. We've had Lana Turner on, which is a comedian. She's a comedian out of L.A. We have Jill Michelle Melian coming on in a couple weeks. She was on Mad TV.
Right.
I remember Mad TV. Yeah, so I'm trying to work with some of the celebrities because I see a parallel there with secularism and comedy. If you watch a lot of stand up like I do, you see a lot of ripping on religion or riffing with religion. And I think, to open us up to a more mainstream audience, that's kind of the way to do it. So bring the celebrities into our world and see, if they find value. And so far it's worked out. And what's nice about Eric and Hannibal is they knew we were an atheist organization, and they hired us to bring guests to their live show knowing that. So that was awesome.
Right, yeah. Well, and I think something that Jason said in our discussion between part 1 and part 2 was really important. What I do as a podcast, you guys are a committee, an organization that happens to do a podcast.
Right.
Like, you guys are an organization first that puts together these massive events. The huge debate that was just so amazing between Bart Ehrman and Robert Price. It was a debate I've been looking forward to since it was teased like a year and a half before it actually happened.
Yeah.
And, they're trying to secure the funding for it and whatnot. Like, you guys are actually the boots on the ground making that happen. And then it just so happens on Sunday you come into the studio and make a podcast.
Yeah.
So it's like, but that being said, like the podcast that you do, people might say, well, why do I want to listen to a mythicist podcast, right? Because I on Naked Mormonism, I had David Fitzgerald on to talk about the Heretic's Guide to Western Religion,
right?
Book 1, The Mormons, and it was great. But of course, we spent the first half talking about mythicism because I love the field of study, and he's just a fun guy to talk to, right?
Yeah.
I caught a lot of shit for that episode,
really,
and people are like, David Fitzgerald, he's a wackaloon and a quack, and he doesn't have any he's not a real historian. It doesn't, and I'm just like, well, he's a really intelligent guy. He's obviously done a shitload of research,
Right.
and he presented his work.
Right.
That I don't do anything else with any other people. That's just what I do on the show.
Right.
But that's what you guys are doing to a much greater extent. You don't just focus on mythicism. Obviously, you can't focus on that for 3.5 years of podcasting.
Yeah, we
right?
have like 10 shows, and then that would be it.
Right.
Yeah.
So you guys, I mean, like your last episode was Sean Carroll, PhD physicist, theoretical physicist. I mean, he's been on all kinds of other podcasts, and he's done, TV interviews and stuff.
Yeah.
And an incredibly intelligent guy.
Yeah.
You don't focus on mythicism exclusively. You're bringing together a broader community, and just you're doing it under the umbrella of Mythicist Milwaukee, and it's really powerful.
It's not set out to prove mythicism. This isn't saying you have to believe this. This is the truth. The metal can't bend because it's not hot enough. Kind of conspiracy theory. The idea is that there is reasonable doubt, at least on some of these narratives, to a certain extent. Like even Carrier would say, what's the preponderance of evidence? But even if you have reasonable doubt, I think that's enough to create space for people to think, okay, is everything I'm being taught is real?
Mm-hmm.
How do I know the earth is really round? That to quote Hitchens, but to just take a look at your fundamental assumptions.
Yeah, and it's more getting to the history. We're not going to sit here. Some people in the organization have a stance on whether or not Jesus exists, and not even all of us agree. But it's getting to the history and looking at what we have, what we don't have, and that's pretty much the core of what we want to do with the mythicist title. And I always bring this up too. If you're a fundamental Christian, you're a mythicist toward a fundamental Islamic traditions and what the Quran says. So you're yourself a mythicist to Islam, just not to Christianity or to Buddhism or to Hinduism. But yeah, it's really just for us to kind of popularize that word a little bit, and also to kind of get to the history of what we know and what we don't know.
Well, and also I think there needs to be said that you're reserving a place at the table for the minimalist argument, right? Mm-hmm. And that needs to be out there because it's kind of been on the fringe of Christian studies for a while. I mean, people have been discussing it for a long time. I mean, even back to Enlightenment authors were talking about this. This is an important question, and it can't just be thrown away because it's absurd.
Right.
Because when you really dig in and bury yourself in the evidence, it's really not as cut and dried as so many people present it or are familiar with the case of. So I think, like myself, I try and reserve a place at the table for some possible fringe theories in Mormon history, because some of them can be easily debunked, others cannot. We touched on the Spalding theory a little bit. Personally, I think that there might be some merit to it, but the vast majority of Mormon historians scoff at it. Just the same thing with Christian and Bible scholars. They scoff at minimalism.
Yeah.
So somebody has to be on the front lines reserving a seat at the table of historical studies for those theories.
Right. And Jesus is a hotly debated topic right now, the debated figure. But if you go in the past, even a couple decades, Moses being a historical person, I mean, that's widely accepted as he was a myth. Adam, Eve, I mean, all these characters that we see in the Abrahamic faiths were considered historical. And over time, as we get more information and more people talking about it, they go away. They go into, I like to say, they move into mythology, kind of like all the other religions have moved into mythology.
Yeah.
But unfortunately not obscurity.
And like a good paper, a good scientific paper would say, we've seen this result and demonstrated it. More work needs to be done in this field to substantiate it. I mean, that's essentially what we're saying.
Very, very good. Well, and I'm always for putting out petitions for more scholarship and more research, because we're never going to know anything unless we really get into the work,
and ask the questions, and have the questions allowed to be asked. Correct. That's the other thing.
Yeah, exactly.
At least, in Christianity, you can do that. In other religions, you can't. I mean, every religion at one point has tried to suppress it.
Exactly.
The Catholic Church tried to stop translations of the Bible into the vernacular that people that could read English and other languages. Islam seems to be very resistant to it. I mean, but I'm sure it's fundamental sects of all stripes don't like this.
And I'll just, if I can just share one story quick, on Islam, Muhammad Kalish is a very interesting character. He was hired as Germany's first Islamic scholar, so he actually was the first paid Islamic scholar, and he had a career in Germany, and he came to the same conclusions as we do with Jesus, with Muhammad, having the same historical problems. probably not existing. That's what his conclusion was. And, after he came forward with that information, his life was threatened. He was forced to leave the country. He was forced to change, careers. So it's kind of like, if you're not worried about this type of information getting out or these type of questions, why do you have to behave in a way like that? I mean, it makes you look kind of guilty,
That was one thing that since I've embraced skepticism essentially, and since I've begun entrenching myself in historical studies, I often have to ask myself the question: is there information out there that I'm scared of?
Yep.
Information that exists that I don't want to learn.
Yep.
And I can't possibly conceptualize what that is. Right? As a believing Mormon, we're always taught to fear anti-Mormon literature. It's this broad label that's slapped on anything that doesn't agree with what the church claims as its narrative. And everything else Mormons are afraid of talking about, or they're afraid of looking into the sources. I scarcely can conceive of what something like that might be in my own mind.
Right.
I'm drawing a blank.
The only analogy I can think of is they've been made famous on House. Would you take a look at your Huntington's disease test results? Maybe you want to know, maybe you don't. But I can see the amount that I could feel if I was in that position. I don't know, but that you shouldn't force society to live like this.
Yeah, well,
let somebody else look at it.
I'd like to analyze that, because I remember watching that episode and thinking, would I want to know, right? Because that's what it forces, is an inner reflection of like, am I scared to know when I'm going to die, right?
Right.
Well, I also think more information in that case could be very liberating, right? Because if you know that you have Huntington's disease, like in that guy's case, his mom was dying from it, and once they found out it was Huntington's, there's a genetic test that's available for it. Well, we now have CRISPR technology. When House was around, CRISPR didn't exist, gene editing software. Mm-hmm. Now, it's really hard to edit genes on an adult, but it's easy to do in vitro. If we can further the study of Huntington's disease and the cure for it, by having more people, or knowing about more people that have it and being able to identify those genetic markers, I would say, if there's something I can contribute by knowing that I have it, or if I can be an advocate for it, spreading more knowledge about Huntington's disease, that's going to be better in the long run for everybody.
Right.
My selfishness of not knowing when I want to die, that should be cast aside and, critically examined.
Great or good, but just the knowledge of the test being taken will affect it. I mean, so the person that doesn't want to look at the results, I don't want to, but I know that there's a 50% chance or whatever that I could have it. That probably will affect my life. So it would seem to me that, the very believer that says, I don't want to look into this because I'm scared I'm wrong. That's an offense I can empathize with.
And we're always willing to hear any new, piece of evidence that's come out. I mean, we had Lana Einhorn on the show, and she was advocating for Jesus being this Egyptian character in the Gospels. And we had her on. We listened to her story. I'm not completely bought into it. I think there's better explanations, but we're not against hearing people's differing opinions and new evidence. So yeah, we're definitely open.
You just don't want to deny Huntington's is a disease,
right?
That's what the fundamentals.
Yes, yeah, exactly. Well, and and it's just even giving a platform to those ideas, right? And you said it perfectly. Better explanations,
right?
If we can take what somebody says, take their best evidence, and it doesn't stand up to the currently accepted theory,
right?
Then we have to accept that, right? Simple as that.
Yep.
But of course, I mean, given any type of research that you engage in, there are plenty of people that would argue that there's substantiation for ancient aliens.
Right.
So, we can scoff at it as well, but there's a huge body of scholarship and research that's being done on it, and we're all ignorant of it. I mean, I don't know about Jason, or I guess I don't know about.
Jason got Joe Nickel on the podcast, so we've done.
Yeah, we had Joe Nickel.
We've touched on.
Yeah, you touched on it, right? Yeah. But you haven't entrenched yourself into the world. I mean, I've recently embarked upon this a similar thing with Mormon history, and that's the Joseph using hallucinogens theory.
Yeah.
Because it's such a small subsect. Very few people have talked about it, and I feel like it has a great deal of explanatory power. But the vast majority of Mormon scholars aren't going to go study the effects of psilocybin and LSD and and what it takes in order to create a non-poisonous ergot tincture that you strip off the alkaloids because you boil in the tincture, you boil oil on top of it and then strip off the oil that pulls off out all the alkaloids that make it so you have seizures when you're on ergot, right? Mormon historians don't want to talk about that because those are Schedule 1 drugs.
Yeah.
Right? And as soon as you start talking about it, you're a wackaloon. But if it has explanatory power, it needs to have a seat at the table.
Absolutely. And there were many religions that started from those hallucinogens, like those mushrooms and things like that. I mean,
the stoned ape theory. It's a thing.
Yeah.
But even sleep, just dreams and dream world. Like, how do you know you're not going to another plane of existence?
Well, that's what's funny about Christianity in general. A lot of the earlier Christian sects were more revelatory driven. They were more driven by people's revelations. And they're getting these revelations from dreams, from, people that were touched, quote unquote touched, people that have mental illness, and some of the hallucinogens, things like that. That's where some of these concepts come from. I mean, this it seems like science fiction almost to us, but I mean that's where this stuff comes from is revelation.
And the most interesting part is the more that I dive into it, the more it's like this is actually a viable theory, because the way that we view hallucinogen and drug use now, it's a post-war on drugs perspective, right? People in the 1800s didn't care about cocaine and opium. It wasn't, you weren't going to get arrested and thrown in jail for your life.
It wasn't illegal.
Cocaine was in Coke when it first came out.
Exactly. It was Coca-Cola for a reason.
Right.
I mean, after I put out the episodes talking about the hallucinogens, I had a listener that goes by the screen name Vanishing Man. He gets in touch all the time and sends me all kinds of awesome shit. But he sent over a snapshot of a recipe that's been in his family since I think he said about the 1870s. It was his great-grandmother's recipe, and it was for an opium tincture.
Nice.
Yeah.
And he related the story that she would send his mother, 12 years old at the time, to go walk down to the local emporium to pick it up, or his grandmother, I guess it would be, to pick up the tincture, to pick up the opium.
Yeah.
She just got 12 years old. I mean, we can't put our minds there.
Right.
Like they didn't have the social taboos on these things that we have.
It was a different time.
Right.
And
it's all about...
Yeah, if you're going to Prohibition, you
and
can't have any alcohol. I mean, Milwaukee is literally created on breweries and beer, and if you go in the Prohibition times, that is completely taboo.
Well, and there's a bunch of I know there's like speakeasy tours and stuff in Chicago, right?
Yeah.
And when you try and drive these things underground, the underground is going to exist.
Exactly.
We just bought it all from Canada, right? And then all the microbreweries essentially went out of existence.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
it's a shame.
Yeah, cycles repeating. Cycles repeating. I mean, hopefully we see marijuana legalized, and then we can tax it, and then we can bring in more jobs and better economy, and all of that thing. Hopefully, maybe we can get the opium for that recipe in like 20 years or so.
Well, and there are some research institutes that are doing, studying psychedelics. Like MAPS is one of them that I learned about through the guy that presented this theory on the podcast. Is they're studying psychedelics and their effects on it and the medicinal purposes for it, because there are a great number of people that microdose mushrooms or whatever daily, and it's their tincture, right? It's their medicine. Whether you're dosing yourself with nicotine or morphine or whatever, people have been using chemicals to alter their mental states for tens of thousands of years, as far as we can tell. And if you buy into the stoned ape theory, for millions of years. So the simple fact that we malign these things now because we have the current taboo perspective, that shouldn't affect the historical accuracy.
Right. And it doesn't in medicine. I mean, you can get cocaine at your Pyxis in your hospital because it's a potent vasoconstrictor. That it's, the medicine shouldn't have to have taboos. That's what I'm saying.
Exactly. But of course, these are huge digressions, and we have not talked about anything that we would make this actually a part 2 of a discussion. So I know that we kind of touched on a lot of things. Like I said, scratched the surface, but there were a few things that we really should dive into as well. I know you have an entire sheet of notes. I think we got 2 lines.
I just thought your video producer. I just thought would be or your video. What is that called? A camera. Right, a camera.
It's a thing.
Yeah, it is a thing, right? And it could, like you said, is the future, and that's why I wanted to say it was January 15th, 2017, because Joseph Smith also predicted a very big, large coming war that he said would originate in South Carolina. He's essentially predicted the Civil War. Fascinating, obviously, I think coincidental. But, I mean, is that ever used to, is Joseph Smith's prophetic power ever used in his defense in Mormonism, especially today?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and Joseph wasn't the only person talking about a war coming out of the Confederacy.
South Carolina seemed like it would be where it would come from, too.
That wasn't an original thought in his mind. He was just taking what he was having discussions with his fellow abolitionists, freedom-loving, northern statesmen. I mean, to take something that he said and extract it out of the time that he was living in and say that's prophetic is utter bullshit. Okay, the word of wisdom is that's what Mormons use as their no coffee, no beer or alcohol, no whatever. They oftentimes point to that and say, well, there are these guidelines to be, you eat meat sparingly and all of these really good, healthy things that people in Joseph Smith's day didn't know about. And that's utter bullshit. Absolutely utter bullshit. This was at the beginning stages of when sanitariums began to arise. And people started thinking grains and stuff, we referenced Miller earlier in part 1. William Miller, he basically ran on a campaign. John Harvey Kellogg is who I'm thinking of, ran on a campaign that essentially a well-balanced diet of grains and oats and multiple enemas a day will keep you from masturbating, because masturbation is essentially what is so detrimental to society. It's fucking everything over. And it's unfortunate that the guy that was right about so much shit about health and diet and exercise and bathing yourself once a week, he was wrong by the mechanism for which he arrived at his correct conclusions. He was just trying to do it to curb masturbation. And he also started circumcision and using acid on clitori, I guess it would be. Because
is that female genital mutilation?
That is female genital mutilation, yes. Wow. That was going on in the 1860s, long before Kellogg and Post, the companies that we eat cereal from now, were ever founded by these same crazy religious psychopaths. So
did not know that.
I did not know that either.
So just because somebody arrives at a conclusion based on shitty information doesn't mean that they got there because they were working off the correct information. It's just that they happened to land in there. Same thing with Joseph and his prophecies oftentimes. If we try and I have a couple stories I want to share. If we try and do a statistical comparison of Joseph Smith's failed revelations versus his true revelations, I don't think that any Mormon would believe in him as a true prophet, because all it takes is one false prophecy to be a false prophet, right? If you say one thing in the name of God and it turns out to not be true, you are a false prophet from then on. You cannot be trusted. And that was oftentimes why, the Fanny Alger affair chased so many people off, because Joseph was railing against adultery, and then he's found fucking this 17-year-old in the barn. So, but these stories that I want to share here, recently I shared something on the podcast, and I had to publish a retraction of it because I couldn't find substantiation for it. I talked to you about this in the parking lot.
Yeah, we talked about this,
Well, luckily, I put out the petition out there, and I said, I cannot find substantiation for this, and I've looked everywhere. I've looked in all of the books that I've been reading recently, thumbing through all of the pages, trying to find this source. I cannot find it, so I have to retract this story. Well, I'm glad I have a good listenership who wants to rally for these things and actually look into these and do the research that I'm incapable of doing, because I'm focused on researching stuff for the show itself. So this listener sent in a link to a Reddit thread that mentioned something. So the story that I related in the podcast was Joseph Smith was obviously a con man, and he used props for his cons, and he trained a dove to fly in and eat some grain out of his ear. And then he would say, it's the Spirit of the Lord. It's the messenger delivering me a message. And then it'd fly away.
Why is it always a dove? It's always a dove. Isn't it?
It could be a pigeon, right? They're trainable too.
Didn't the ark have a dove as well when the flood was over? Yeah. Sorry, I digress.
So, Joseph, I couldn't find this, and thank you to the listener who sent this in. I'm going to have to stitch it in later who it was because I can't remember right now. And, of course, my phone doesn't want to load newspapers.com because it's terrible reception.
Welcome to our mall.
Okay, so this is why it's deserted. Okay. It had it for a
You
second.
can't get on Facebook while you're at TJ Maxx.
Right, that's a problem.
no.
That's a problem.
Going on.
I can't post selfies of the crap that I'm buying here. Okay, so Joseph Smith was not opposed to using props. So finally I found, thanks to this listener, the article, and I'm reading it from a PDF of the original newspaper published in 1843. And the title of it is A Mormon Miracle Knocked in the Head. One of Joe Smith's holy clan finding that the disclosure of Mormonism by Bennett, that's John C. Bennett, there was a huge falling out between him and Joseph Smith, had the effect of shaking the faith of his followers. So when Bennett left, he took a lot of people with him, essentially. Determined to set his brain to work to invent a scheme how to recover the lost confidence of his congregation, cost what it might. For this purpose, he procured a dove and taught the bird to fly to him and eat from his ears, in which he placed the grain that served for his daily food. Having, as he thought, sufficiently trained the bird, he gave out on the next Sabbath, after lecturing, he would prove by a miracle that he was a prophet of God. The day came. The meeting house was crowded. One of Aaron's unsophisticated sons had been procured under promise of eternal secrecy to hide himself in the garret and to let the messenger of peace fly at the word of command. So he was waiting with a cage with the dove and waiting for the cue.
It's a magic trick.
Trained up.
All was arranged. With a countenance lit up with confidence of success, the Latter-day Saint began his exhortation. Joseph preaching up on the stand, firebrand. Pronounced Bennett a scoundrel, a liar, an impostor. And to prove his assertions, he said with a loud voice, called on heaven to send down its Holy Spirit in the form of a dove, as it appeared, hovering over Savior when baptized in the river Jordan. Of course, right?
Yeah.
Harkening back to the Bible, a dead silence prevailed.
This is suspense, right? I mean,
Each eye was fixed with superstitious awe on the excited prophet, who, with extended arms, loudly called for the Holy Ghost. Again and again he called, but still no answer was made. At last, fearful that his Hibernian agent in the loft had not heard him, he fairly burst forth as he frantically clapped his hands and stamped his feet. Holy Ghost, appear! When lo and behold, the Irishman's red fizz protruded through the crack of the ceiling and addressed the discomfited prophet in the wise. And then this is quoting Joseph. Hurrah, be Jesus, how can the Holy Ghost be after making his appearance? Hasn't the cat ate him? So essentially, the dove never came.
That's
and
hilarious.
they're like, well, did a cat eat it?
That is so funny.
cat got your tongue and got your
That
spirit.
is so funny. So I would love
false
to,
prophet.
I would love to see his explanation for that. You know, like how, when the dove doesn't come. What do you
Right.
do? What do you do at that point?
Well, I maybe, we'll go outside. He'll come by sometime. Don't worry,
Right.
guys. Don't worry. We're good. Like, so, I mean, this is the false prophet.
Mm-hmm.
This is he made a prophecy that a dove would fly in and speak the words of the Lord. And the con that he had set up failed, as did many of his cons. And people didn't leave.
It just yeah.
flew over their heads.
That's why I think people just love being fooled. You know, when you go to it, and like the early magicians, if they had religious ties, I'm sure there were religions that popped up from like magicians that were really good that can say, you know, I can do this, I can show this trick, because people love being fooled. You know, the street magician, what's his name?
Chris Angel?
No, not Chris. Well, Chris Angel, but the other
David Blaine.
David Blaine does a lot of tricks that it's hard to see because he has these things practiced. And I saw his latest special with the celebrities where he's like putting stuff in his hand and like doing all this crazy stuff. And you know, if you're in a time where people want to feel like that's Jesus working through him, they like to be fooled. I don't know what else to say there.
This is a perfect example. I'm so glad you brought up David Blaine and Chris Angel. I mean, you've seen their walking on the water.
Yeah, the
tricks,
walking
right?
on water and the levitating, right?
In this same Reddit post, and the dove story was only just like 3 words at the end of the post. It just referenced where to find it, the reference or the newspaper clipping to find it, and I was able to go on newspapers.com, their massive archive of over 200 million pages of newspapers, and actually read the firsthand accounting of it. Well, here's another relation of a story of Joseph Smith, apparently, and this was reprinted in the 1880 History of Shenango County. Quote, to convince the believers that he did possess supernatural powers, he announced that he would walk upon the water. The performance was to take place in the evening, and to the astonishment of unbelievers, he did walk upon the water, where it was known to be several feet deep, only sinking a few inches below the surface. This providing a success, a second trial was announced, which bid fair to be as successful as the first. But when he proceeded some distance into the river, he suddenly went down, greatly to the disgust of himself and proselytes, but to the great amusement of the unbelievers.
That's great.
Hang on. It appeared on examination that planks were laid in the river a few inches below the surface, and some wicked boys had removed a plank, which caused the prophet to go down like any other mortal.
That's brilliant. How do you come back from that? I don't know. And now we have Mormonism, and it's destroying people's lives.
But he's a prophet.
Yeah, and he's a prophet. Right.
Claim, I had a momentary lapse of faith.
Right.
Yeah, clearly.
Oh, kudos to the listener that found that.
Yeah.
That was awesome.
But so you mentioned like Joseph Smith isn't often with modern day Mormonism used as a defense. This is so much as more of like a George Washington kind of figure, but not that kind of defense. Is Brigham Young the same, or is
Absolutely.
he considered much more mainstream? So is modern day Mormon is more about Brigham Young and less about Joseph Smith?
It's all about Joseph Smith because Brigham Young made it that way. So Brigham Young, as soon as he got to Utah, he began a vicious campaign to propagandize Joseph Smith, essentially, and create him into this amazing prophet figure and change the history. So Dan Vogel recently did a comparative analysis of the history of the church. The history of the church is a 7-volume set, and essentially it's written from the prophet's firsthand accounts, and it's written, on this day I did this, blah, 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 blah. Well, that was compiled later. It was compiled after his death and published. They began compiling it and publishing it in their newspapers before he died, but the full 7-volume set was published in, I think, mid-1850s or something.
Okay.
Dan Vogel, an amazing Mormon historian, did a comparative analysis of where they took all of these firsthand accounts from, the journal entries or the minutes from, meeting notes or whatever, and compared them to the history of the church version. And out of the 7 volumes, there's tens of thousands of differences. There are, entire paragraphs that are changed. Accounts that were initially written by a scribe, William Clayton or Oliver Cowdery, were changed to say, I did this, I, the prophet, I, blah, 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 when they were really, the prophet did this. The amount that Brigham Young, the lengths that Brigham Young went to champion Joseph Smith as the martyred true prophet, set up a legacy for Mormonism forever. Brigham Young was a businessman, simple as that. And Joseph Smith was a damn good sales pitch.
Right.
Simple as that.
And this isn't unique. In Christianity, Paul did this for Jesus. In Islam, the successor Muhammad, like a couple centuries later, did this for Muhammad in the Hadith. L. Ron Hubbard, modern example, same thing. It's the same story. The stories in the Church of Scientology compared to what L. Ron Hubbard actually did, it's completely different. This is it's the same thing repeating.
What's
over
more
and over
extraordinary to me, like in hadiths in Muhammad's case, right? And it's Bukhari, like 220 years later, put together all these 200,000 hadiths, whittled them down to like 10,000. But these were oral traditions, right? Imagine how much oral traditions might be able to get changed without a direct record when we have first-hand sources that are being altered, and yet you still believe it. Well, God.
That makes it even more harder to believe that people will still take the
It's
the made up
yeah.
story versus actually going and doing the research. But again, it kind of goes back to your analogy. Do you want to see if you have the disease? Do you want to go and check?
Yeah,
so a lot of people
want to believe what I want to believe should be the name of the story.
That should be the motto for all of human existence.
That's true. That's true.
Yeah, absolutely.
Ancient aliens too. I want to believe.
You're right. Exactly.
So Brigham Young does this. The polygamy laws were passed in 1862, which I found that. Wow, you got a raging civil war, and Antietam just gets done. Oh, let's pass some polygamy laws. I guess the Congress had to do something. They didn't have to worry about the Southern voters, I suppose. But so they passed the anti-polygamy laws. But the sources I checked say maybe 20 to 25% of the Mormon community was actually polygamous at that time. Is that correct?
Much lower than that, actually. I mean, I guess I maybe I shouldn't just make a vast generalization and say much lower than that. But the numbers that I've heard are much, much lower than that. Essentially, especially in the Joseph Smith years, it was just him and his fewest, closest followers that were practicing it. And it was even, among the people that knew it, it was very on the DL. It was hush-hush. Nobody talked about what was going on. And the only way that we really know about it is through stuff like the Nauvoo Expositor and, John Bennett's accounts. And, of course, the firsthand accounts of the people that were going through polygamy. Brigham Young, he oftentimes used polygamy as a bartering chip. So he would say to any given church leader, okay, you need to go down and colonize this area, say St. George. He initially called St. George Dixie, and it's still called St. Dixie. It's a town, the southernmost town, essentially, in Utah. It's about an hour, 2 hours outside of Las Vegas. And he said, go down there and grow cotton. Well, if you've ever been to St. George, you cannot fucking grow cotton in St. George. But that was the deal, is you get a couple of wives for doing it. And he sent people up to Canada and down to Mexico, and he settled Morador basically by using polygamy as a bit of a bartering chip. So maybe 25% is somewhat accurate, but I've heard numbers that were significantly lower.
So polygamy was one of their marketing ploys, kind of like Paul when he took out circumcision being a requirement. That's more, people want to be a part of that sect because they don't have to cut a piece of their penis off. So in this case, you don't have to, you can have multiple wives. So that was actually used that way.
I don't know if Mormonism was ever sold that way, because even the people that did practice polygamy, oftentimes the government was enough opposed to it that they didn't want. I mean, these people were oftentimes in hiding from armies that were marching in because of polygamy being illegal, right? So before polygamy was illegal or made illegal, it was still taboo in society. It was still, only like the Oneida group and the crazy Mormonites actually practice.
Yeah, the Confederates were not cool with polygamy either, right? They wanted to ditch it. So it seems like a major liability. But go on.
Well, and that's exactly the point. So it's like you keep it on the down low. You don't use it as a sales pitch. You use you use the sense of community as a sales pitch, exactly the way that Mormonism is today. And the same thing, when you get into Mormonism, you don't learn about Kolob for a few years. I mean, unless you read the Book of Abraham yourself. I mean, it's much like Scientology. You have to get to certain degrees before you learn certain things. Yeah. But all that information is out there and available. You can learn it through other means. But you're not going to have church leaders telling you these religious tenets unless you increase your grade up to, counselor to the bishop or to the bishopric or the stake presidency or the quorum of the 70s. As you move up the ladder, you get certain privileges and knowledge afforded to you.
Yeah, that's a really ancient concept. That's the mystery religion model. You don't, you tell a story to the outsiders. This is what the outsiders know. The people on the inside get the real story, and they know what's going on, right? In Scientology, before South Park and the internet, unfortunately, you had to be in 200,000 before you learned about Xenu.
Right.
Yeah.
What do you think that is under Brigham Young? Does the hierarchical structure work the same way that it does in the modern LDS church?
Yeah, very similar. That structure was actually set out in 1835, where they set out the Quorum of the 12 and the Quorum of the 70, and it was structured based off of the people that were valiant enough to go march on Zion's camp. Zion's camp was the first military action that Joseph ever took. People were chased out of their homes in Jackson County, Missouri, out of Zion in 1833. At the end of 1833, 1834, Joseph organizes a campaign of 200 armed men to march to Missouri to reinstate the Mormons. It was an utter disaster, complete failure, and the only casualties happened because of cholera. Such is the Joseph way. He fails at everything he does. It's amazing. But the people that were involved in that, every person that was called to the Quorum of the 70 was a part of Zion's camp. The majority of the people that were called to the Quorum of the 12, they were involved in leadership roles in Zion's camp. So that was organized very early on, and it still exists the same way today in the church from what Joseph Smith organized it. It's one of the few vestiges of the Joseph Smith Church that still exists in the LDS.
It's interesting. And I was wondering, because Joseph Smith, for those that actually do the research, such as yourself, con man, terrible person, did some terrible things. The story is when you die, he actually is one of the people at the table that judges you in your life to make sure that you were a good person. Is that still taught? Joseph Smith's going to judge you at the end of your life?
Absolutely. Joseph taught that himself. In this book I've been reading recently is the 1838 Mormon War in Missouri by Stephen LeSueur. In there, he recounts a situation between Joseph Smith and somebody that was opposed to the military actions Joseph was taking in 1838. And essentially, John Corral, that's what his name was. Essentially, Joseph said that I'm going to stand at the gates and oppose you. And, even if I have to take a fisticuff to do it. So he's like, in paradise, I'm going to be going down to Nux with you to make sure that you don't get into heaven. Like, it's absurd, but that is absolutely true, and Mormons still teach it today.
I guess that it still follows. If there can be angels warring in heaven, there can be a bar brawl.
Well, right. Why not, right?
Yeah, why not?
Sure. It's
right.
Stupid.
So, yeah, that's preserved. And so to bring around, he didn't live to see statehood, but that hierarchical piece is preserved going on, but then they ditch the polygamy at some point, and that's because it wasn't being widely practiced.
Well, it was being practiced just as in the Joseph and Brigham years, just by the upper echelon, right? And it was almost a rite of passage. If you read Doctrine and Covenants 132, which is the polygamy revelation, it was published after Joseph's death, but it was the historical links that tie it to being an actual Joseph revelation are really strong, even though it was published after his death. You read that, it says explicitly, you have to have at least 3 wives to get into the celestial kingdom. You don't get into heaven unless you are a polygamist. So the only people that got to practice that, of course, were the upper echelon, the people that were devoting their lives to service in the church.
Okay, so that number 3 in Big Love, he has 3 different wives. That's actually significant.
Yeah. Absolutely. Well, the number 3 is really significant to Joseph Smith in a lot of ways. In occult practices, the angel Moroni appearing 3 times and, denying him the plates 3 times and all kinds of stuff. 3 is a big number with Joseph.
Yeah, and again, he's taking from these Abrahamic, these notions, 3's big, 12's big. And the one thing I want to point out, because a lot of people have a misconception that the biblical characters, marriage is taught in the Bible, one man, one woman, when actually the biblical characters, Moses, David, like all these characters, had multiple wives. So polygamy is not it's not far off from what the Abrahamic supernatural leaders practiced. I mean, this is common. We just think modern day it's kind of strange, but if you take it back to the book, the holy book, it's right there.
Right. The first revelation we have from Joseph Smith was from 1831, a year after the church was organized. He commanded the mission troop to go out and marry the Lamanites' wives, and they or take wives of the Lamanites, essentially to turn them white and delightsome and righteous. And he was asked by, I want to say it was partly Pratt or whoever relayed the story. They said, "But Joseph, I have a wife. How will I do that?" And Joseph said, "The way the prophets of old did."
Yeah.
it was normal back then. That was a typical thing. Women were property, right? Yep. You would pass them, you would pay a dowry, and you would take on a wife, or it was a uniting of two warring families, or whatever. Women were just property. Yeah. Same in Joseph's time.
Well, same in our time. It's still happening in Saudi Arabia, in the Middle East. I mean,
in places in America.
In places in America. You're right. Yeah. You're absolutely right. I mean, it's not talked about in the major media, I guess. I don't hear much about it, but you watch Vice, you watch these underground exploratory journalists. They go into it, man, and it's still happening. These women don't have a choice. They're essentially property. They're traded as property.
The idea of love marriages was groundbreaking in the 1920s. That's the 20th century that people are like, these kids are getting married because they love each other?
Good point.
Not because their dads are business partners? What's going on?
Right.
Short circuit, right?
Right.
What we consider as like a typical marriage ideal from our, privileged sense that we have right now, that's very, very young. I mean, we're still at a very young age of what we consider conventional marriage today. The vast majority of marriages throughout most of human history have been a horrible situation.
Yep.
Not consensual.
Right.
And a transfer of property.
The culture, even like at the turn of the century, my grandparents, my mother loves to tell me the story that they're married in the 20s, but you moved and you gave up your friends as a wife, and then you just hung out with your husband's social circle.
Green acres.
That's what you did, and it was sort of accepted. It was kind of sucky, but that's what you did. So I imagine, there's a lot of cultural
going out to the singles bars and meeting a bunch of singles. That wasn't
right. But that's what the 20s did give us, is prohibition and the first women and men mixing in bars. And I think, I'm not a social scientist, but perhaps that's where love comes from.
They call it a social lubricant for a reason.
Right. Yeah, but it's still mind-boggling that, there's cultures today that still practice these, traditions. And
some of them believe in the Book of Mormon.
And some of them, yes, absolutely.
Yeah. But ultimately, when the LDS says, okay, we're not going to go with polygamy, that's when the break off sex. The true fundamentalists, then we have peppered around, and they said, no, well, we're not going with that.
Well, because, so Brigham Young had established these various communities that were, the leadership of those communities were based on polygamy. And then the presidency of the church transfers to John Taylor, the third prophet, who there's some speculation that he was essentially given. Brigham Young said that you can be prophet of the church after I die if you follow me out to Utah. And he kept to it. John Taylor was the third of the fourth person who was shot in Carthage, but he didn't die. He was shot like 6 times, but still didn't die. Hiram Smith and Joseph Smith were the ones.
Rasputin.
Yeah, right. And for some reason, Willard Richards, the cousin of Brigham Young, who was, a 350-pound, of flesh wall who would have been easily shot, remained unscathed. There's conspiracy theories out there, but that being said, when it transferred to John Taylor, he continued practicing polygamy, and then he gets to the Wilford Woodruff years, and that's when statehood became a priority. That's when they were trying to say, okay, we are colonizing more and more of America. More non-Mormons are coming out here. We can't run this like our theocracy anymore. This isn't the Wild West. We have to civilize ourselves.
Yeah, the trains are also coming in. It's a lot harder to get there.
Yeah, well, I mean,
or a lot easier to get there. Sorry.
Yeah, in transfer of goods and all kinds of stuff. Yeah, and people were, like Mark Twain made his trip out to Utah in I think 1865 or 1870 or something like that, and he wrote Roughing It. That was his cross country trip, and he talked about the Mormons and the Book of Mormon being chloroform in print. But so 1893 rolls around, and the presidency says we need to get statehood, so we need to, and the government says you can't get it unless you abolish the twins of barbarism, get rid of polygamy. So eventually it came down to essentially a political standoff, and the church published what were called the First and the Second Manifestos. They were never revelations. They were never divinely inspired, thus saith the Lord things, saying polygamy is no longer a thing. They were just like, we don't practice polygamy anymore, nor do we recommend that anybody practices polygamy. But even after Utah gained its statehood, it was practiced a little bit beyond that, and even into the Joseph Fielding Smith years.
Yeah, we touched on the real world consequences of the polygamous compounds. The boys getting kicked out, the lost boys, the girls not being educated, having a choice in this. We had Tony Ortega on. He was part of the Going Clear documentary. He's spent his life studying Scientology, and he had told us that the people coming in, I don't know what recruitment percentages for Scientology is, like way down, like way down. Like they're just lying when they make up their numbers now. In Mormonism, do you see is it growing in popularity, or is it stagnant, or is it actually decreasing?
Well, in part one, we briefly touched on the Mormon exodus that happened. I think it was 2 years ago, where there were over 1,000 Mormons that gathered outside of Temple Square in response to the church's stance on gay families. Yeah, and it's they stood in solidarity, and there were. I can't remember the name of the lawyer, but there was a lawyer on site who was essentially just had a big stack of letters that said, I'm the legal counsel for these people. I'm doing this pro bono. Get their name off of your records. And then they just went and turned them all into the church. And that was like 1,500 resignations in one day.
Wow.
I didn't attend it personally. I probably should have. But it was this powerful uprising of especially the younger generation of Mormons saying, you can't put your old fart geriocracy bullshit ideals on us and expect us to take it laying down. We're leaving your fucking church. The church claims that it has 15 million members right now and that it's growing at unprecedented rates. That's simply a lie. If you do the math out, right now it looks to be somewhere between 4 to 5 million. Their missionary force, it used to be much more impressive. And initially it was... when you turn 19, you go, but that left you in this weird, this kind of a twilight zone from when you graduate high school to when you go on your mission. Do I go to a year of college and then, go on my 2-year mission and then come back and try to pick up where I left off at college? Or do I just get a job to help pay for my, for my tuition or for my, mission or whatever? And oftentimes they were going off to a year of college and they would go to one of those damn liberal colleges and never go on their missions. So they changed the age to 18 instead of 19. So as soon as you get out of high school, you can go on your mission. They did that, and they saw, I think it was an 8% increase in their baptism numbers, but it was let's see, I'm taking these from Irreligiosity. I'm not remembering them correctly. Maybe you can help me out here, Jason. Yeah, but essentially, it was this fantastic idea to hopefully get the younger generation out there and increase their numbers, and it flopped. It utterly failed. They have less missionaries out now than they did 10 years ago.
Yeah, and
they have less members now than they did 10 years ago. But they do their semi-annual general conference, and they come on every 6 months and give their statistics. And they say, we have this many churches, this many stakes, this many members, this many blah, blah, blah. We gave this much money in, or we helped in these various humanitarian efforts around the globe. And a lot of those numbers are fabricated.
Yeah. Well,
from all we can tell.
I thought it was interesting because when I was in Kenya, I did notice there were Mormons. And not only were there Mormons in the white shirt and the black pants going around handing out pamphlets. And I was like, wow. So they obviously still have the missionary program. Do they target specific areas, or you got some stats there? Here we go. So statistics released by the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints indicate that there were 296,800 converts last year. The figure marked a 9% increase from 2 years ago, even though the number of missionaries increased by 44%. Okay.
That's not a good return on investment.
No.
So thank you, Jason. Thank you. You got my back.
They still have the missionary program. They're still going into areas like Africa, I'm assuming.
Yeah.
And
everywhere.
Okay.
China, even. Surprisingly enough, they have to get very trickery visas to do it, but they make it happen.
Wow.
It's crazy.
Yeah, but every religion seems to have a very accurate pinpoint number, or at least, they have some number on converts, but they never have the number of who we lost. Who are the apostates? They usually sweep that under the rug and say few.
And I love the fact that the church is hiding those statistics because it just shows that they're a wounded animal. They're hemorrhaging and they don't know what to do. They don't have a solution because no solution exists.
Right. And they're not the only church. And, what I personally think is going to happen is you will see these churches start coming up with more liberal traditions, liberal acceptances. Like, legalizing homosexual marriages, all these things. The church historically is just, I always call it the great chameleon because it always adjusts to the modern day, to what the modern secular values are. So legalizing marijuana, legalizing same-sex marriages, legalizing all of these things. The Mormon church, exactly right. The 70s, you see that. In the 50s, you see women taking a bigger role in the Catholic Church. Women's movement, all these things. You will see them continue. Either they evolve or they die. And I don't think Mormonism is excluded from needing to do that.
Well, and it's interesting because you do see a special online community where they're evolving into this. So I attend what's called Sunstone Symposium, and it's a Mormon history conference, essentially. In Salt Lake, it's a 3-day long conference, just chock full of amazing lectures, and it's just for Mormon geeks, essentially. The motto of it was more than one way to Mormon, essentially. And there's all these grassroots movements of like Mo 2.0 and like the evolving versions of the church that are breaking off and saying, we don't care what those old fart Cold War era people are saying. We want to Mormon our own way. And I think that's great. If you can justify your beliefs somehow and they stand up to scrutiny and you can have an open discussion about it, I say then you're welcome to believe whatever you want. Everybody's welcome to believe what they want as long as they aren't afraid of scrutiny, right?
Right. And, the early church was competing with Mithraism in the 1st, 2nd century in Rome. Mithraism was very, you had to really be a part of the club. It was very exclusionary. Christianity started letting in prostitutes, started letting in the poor people, started letting in anyone that was willing to go. And it just reminds me of the Book of Mormon play. Spoilers for those out there. They go to Africa. They take Mormonism, what we know as Mormonism, out to Africa, try to win over these African people, and they completely change the story. All of a sudden, no sex with babies and just crazy shit.
Because people with this, maggots in their scrotum, they're not going to give a shit about some galactic overlord named Elohim. They don't care.
But they came up with their own version of it. The church heads come into Africa to see what these missionaries were able to put together, and it's like not even close to what they teach as Mormonism. The church leaders hate it, but like the African natives take on this new what they call Mormonism. Doesn't look anything like what the church was, but it's adhering to their social norms, to what they need in their society and their community, and that's the chameleon that is the church. And that was a great story by Matt and Trey on that one.
And I think there can be an argument made that it's a manifestation of a social need.
Yeah.
So the central, or one of the ancillary points that it made was converting to this weird evolved version of Mormonism stopped the main guy from fucking babies to get rid of his AIDS.
Right.
So even though they had this weird belief in something that's completely bullshit, it still served a social good.
Yeah.
Right. So we can still see that we have these secular ideals that we have to achieve somehow. And unfortunately, it's often done at the hands of somebody that's a sectarian psychopath.
Right.
Joseph Smith or Brigham Young or, I can't remember the name of the missionaries in the Book of Mormon. But
right, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it still served a purpose, right?
Yeah. I just love how the Africans in there finally realized having sex with babies wasn't a good thing. I'm just waiting for the Catholic Church to follow suit.
That'll never happen.
Yeah.
Never.
Pasadiga evil eye.
Yes, yeah.
But it's important. It's an important issue because although that we are seeing in the West, churches, modernizing, but watering down, if you will. But when you have state-sponsored religion, you see the opposite. I mean, even in the modern times, you're seeing Islam getting more conservative, mainly because it has a lot of money. It has a lot of state sponsorship. Things can drive the other way, and we're seeing the Islamic world go more conservative. At the same time, we're seeing the Western world get that way. I mean, Spain was the same way. That used to, in the 1100s, it was very pluralistic, and then got more conservative with Isabella and Ferdinand. So it's important that secularism be defended, and that's what I think we're really here for, is
right
to defend that, regardless of whether you define yourself as religious or not.
Absolutely. Well, and I mean, you have to say these are secular ideals that are influencing these religions to evolve, right? I mean, we touched on this more than once, women's role in Catholicism. That actually happened about the same time as it did for the RLDS Church, which was Mother Emma's church. Emma Smith, Joseph's wife. That was essentially the church that she was affiliated with after Joseph died. Blacks in the priesthood, right? There's this social and political pressure for the church to change, and it's forced to change. But that social and political pressure, that's purely driven by secularism. Secular humanism, I should say, because we're looking out for each other. Even if you believe in some crazy ass shit, I'm still got your back. I'm still going to take care of you. And if your religious leader is doing something that is detrimental to your existence, I'm going to force that leader to change what they're doing to make your life better. That is the root of secular altruism, and that is absolutely great. Yeah, and it just shows how religion oftentimes impedes progress.
And it's worked twice with Mormonism already. I mean, once in the 1890s with polygamy, right? And then again in 1978. What I'm interested when they came down with the polygamy things, there wasn't a revelation. Like they said, we're just going to, this is a doctrinal thing. What about 1978? Black people are okay to be in the church same way, or was it revelation?
No, that was a revelation. Yes, it was.
So they switched tax.
Yeah, and it was really oddly worded too. It didn't say, the Joseph Smithian, thus saith the Lord, or the Sidney Rigdonian, thus saith the Lord, or anything like that. It was it's just like PR bullshit. I mean, you can read it through all the newspapers on that day, a fateful day in 1978. It was published and republished, and it was spread out. It went viral throughout the world. It's not a revelation, though. It's just like we declare that all men can get the priesthood. Women, yeah, fuck them. But all men, if you got a penis, you got the priesthood.
Civil rights was about race, not sex.
But no, it's perfect. It's the same. It's analogous to Mary and her ascending into heaven. It was never accepted by the Catholic Church that she actually ascended to heaven until the 50s, when you have all these...
The assumption, I think.
The assumption, right. It was always the assumption, and then the doctrine was accepted that she now ascended to heaven. I mean, it's the same thing. And but today, you still have in Mormonism, there still is a prophet that supposedly looks into a hat and a stone, right, and does revelation. Is that accurate?
The church today is a business.
Right.
You can't have a business that's run by a monolithic dictator. Right. I mean, even Trump, as monolithic as he is, and megalomaniacal, his businesses aren't run by him. They're run by a board of directors, and then he slaps his name on everything.
Right.
The church is the same way. They cannot be run anymore by a charismatic person like Joseph Smith, because it's not sustainable.
Right.
The problem with having a charismatic person is, as soon as another person comes along that's more charismatic, you lose all your followers.
Right.
So they're a business now. They can't deal with the unpredictability of what one prophet will reveal. So they're a council of 12, and there's the presidency, the 3 over the quorum of the 12, and everything that they do is unanimously voted on by this board of directors. Simple as that.
Just like how ISIS has a PR director.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's an organization.
The Mormon Church has just a more conservative CEO, and the Catholic Church tends to have a socialist CEO right now, it seems like. But it's weird, because you do see a lot of conservative people reacting. That some of the circles I run in, he's too liberal. Whereas, it's more conservative in the Catholic, or in the Mormon Church. I wonder, did you have, and this can't be proven, on Mitt Romney, do you think he would have used his, would Mormonism have influenced him at all, in your opinion?
Well, do you think the Catholic Church influenced JFK's presidency?
Not really.
The thing with Mormonism
they did with Hitler. The Catholic Church did.
Well, and all of the belt buckles in Germany said "Gott mit uns," which means God's with us. So there's no argument that can be made. But you threw a Hitler grenade into the discussion,
right? Yeah, what 25 years can do. But I don't think it. I personally, it wouldn't have stopped me from voting for him. And I don't remember him talking about these.
Well, if you remember, he's explicitly asked that it not be brought up in the debates.
Because it's uncomfortable,
right.
And he can't get out from under the fact that he's gone through the temple ceremonies before 1990, which include the blood oaths and pledging fealty and all of your possessions to the church, and everything you own and all of your gains. Well, if you're president of the United States, that's considered a gain, gainful employment, right?
Right.
That means you pledge whatever you are or have to the church.
Right.
So that's why he didn't want it brought up, because, it's sacred. No, because it's fucking embarrassing.
Right, and that absolutely influenced me as to whether or not I was going to vote for him. I mean, the fact that this would be the leader of the free world that can't do his research on the Mormonism and the blood rituals. And
do you think he gives a fuck about the church?
No,
though,
of course
really?
not. Of
I mean,
course
he's
not.
a politician.
Of course not. But, you know.
An
You may or may
incredibly
not.
wealthy
I mean,
businessman.
Compared to Mike Pence, perhaps people think he, wears his religious convictions more so than Mitt Romney.
But I would also,
agree.
I would make the
And
argument.
we're scared of Pence.
I know a lot of Mormons that are, kind of similar temperament to the public persona of Mitt Romney, and they make damn good businessmen, and probably would have been an amazing president.
Yeah.
We just don't know, right? I mean, he definitely had conservative ideals, but Mormons aren't irrational. The thing about Mormonism is there's always an answer for your question. It depends on how much of that bullshit you're willing to buy. It determines how, faithful you are in the church, right? So if you ask a Mormon what is heaven, right, they'll say, well, that's where people go when they die. If you say, can you get a little more detailed? They'll say, okay, so we have the telestial kingdom, and that's where murderers go, and adulterers and villains and horrible people. That's a telestial kingdom. One of our prophets said at one point that if you saw the telestial kingdom, you would kill yourself just to get there, because killing yourself is killing an innocent person, and it'd land you in the telestial kingdom. And then, of course, we have the terrestrial kingdom above that, and that's reserved for people that are really, really nice people, but they just don't believe in Jesus, or don't believe in, or they weren't ever Mormons. And then we have the celestial kingdom, and then inside the celestial kingdom, we have 3 different degrees inside of that, and it's only the people that have 3 wives when they die, or get them after they die, and their baptismal ordinances and endowments after that they rise to the 3rd degree of the 3rd degree, that they become gods of their own planet.
Interesting.
It seems like a meritocracy. It does on the surface seem more equitable. But there's just heaven and hell, the binary system.
Exactly, but they always have a detailed answer. So the thing, Mormons are incredibly rational, but oftentimes they don't ever apply that rationality towards their faith.
Right.
They're just good business
and
people.
there's people, in other religions that do the same thing. Logical on the outside, all their decisions, business-wise, anything like that, logical, but they just don't examine.
So what about the niceness? And my dad always says,
it's all
they're
fake.
so damn nice.
Fake. The fakeness that Mormons put forward, it is bullshit. They are all very repressed. These are Utah Mormons I'm talking about. I'm using it from my own experience. They're all very repressed, and they don't control anything in their own lives. Every single part of their day is scripted to a schedule, and they essentially went on missions and never came off of their mission. A stricted, regimented, cult-like, almost militant type idea that pervades the mission field. That's what people...
So you owe that niceness to your community, then. If you don't follow suit, then you can get in trouble.
Well, it's a social contract, right? We all obey the signs on the road. There's nothing forcing us to do it except, consequences. Yep. But, it's a social contract, right? If I'm super nice to you, superficially nice to you, you're going to do the same thing to me, even if we're just blowing smoke up each other's asses.
Yeah, and I guess my final thought is I kind of understand that. I'd understand, if... Growing up in the Mormon church, just like a Scientology church or whatever church, I went on the missions. I did all these things that took a huge chunk of my life. I would understand not wanting to question, because it's kind of like everything you did was for nothing almost. And that's why it's even more, and I admire those that come out and are able to face that and are able to speak out even more, because just knowing the real life toll that would take.
Absolutely. Well, and let's go ahead and take that as a final closing note, because that was very well said. Of course, you guys have something coming up in September.
Myth Information Conference 4.
Thank you. I couldn't words that one right.
Yeah.
So I'm of course
verbiage. Was that verbiage from the event on
a phraseology? Yes, my phraseology was horrible.
Yes.
So I look forward to attending that. That's coming up in September. You guys are doing apparently a bunch of lectures, and other podcasters, Cognitive Dissonance, are going to be there and speaking. You're going to have a debate there between Faisal Saeed Al-Matar and
Azur Namrani, and the popular YouTubers Shuan Head and Armored Skeptic.
Yeah, we're trying to change what a conference looks like. We get a lot of feedback that people don't like the whole come to lecture. And I agree with that because I've been to many conferences where I hate that was the worst part. The talking to people, networking, that's great. But we are trying to put a different spin on it. We are going to be giving first timers their first time on stage, like Cognitive Dissonance, Tom and Cecil from Cognitive Dissonance, Armored Skeptic, and Shoe on Head, and Melissa Chen. That would be their first pretty much lectures in the secular world. And we're going to have the veterans as the guests. So we'll have Matt Delahunty there, Seth Andrews, Aaron Ra, Richard Carrier, David Fitzgerald, even the Scathing Atheist guys, they're going to be there, it sounds like, as well. You're going to be there, hopefully, Bryce, as well.
Yep, planning on it. Yep.
Yeah, so we'll have those people there as guests, and also maybe Killer Priest from the Wu-Tang Clan and Paul Provenza.
Right on.
Let's make socializing a blast.
Yeah, socializing a blast, and then we're going to have the debate on Islam, which we think is a very hot topic these days, especially with Trump in office and the Syrian refugee crisis and all that, and then also finish it off with a movie. So we're trying to create more of an experience for people, so you can actually go. It's going to be a 12-hour day. Let's have some fun, while we're there, instead of just lecture.
Awesome. Well, I have to say I seriously look forward to it. And the myth information this last year was a lot of fun as well. Like I said at the beginning, I mean, I was looking forward to that for so long, and I'm so glad you guys were able to make it happen. You guys are doing amazing work, and I strongly encourage listeners of this show to check out Mythicist Milwaukee. And the camera died, so they're not seeing any of this now. So unfortunately, like the last 20 minutes, it hasn't picked up anything. But still, we're going for it.
You could just put a really cool avatar, in place of me.
A crayon, line paper. But no, I just want to say thank you from the bottom of my heart to you guys for putting this together, for running such a fantastic organization, and for happening to put out a podcast as well. And to all of the listeners listening right now, all the links will be in the show notes for it. Please check them out. They deserve a good listen. And of course, go onto their patreon.com and pledge to support there and watch the video version of part 1. It's good stuff.
Bryce, thank you so much for having us on.
Thank you guys.
Thank you, sir.
Yep.
Yeah.
And that is it for this episode of the podcast. I know this has been kind of long with the historical portion and the Mythicist Milwaukee discussion tacked on. This is probably a little bit longer than I normally should go. I'm kind of breaching that wall of what is like a high quality podcast time frame, but I hope that, you guys have hung around for 7.5 hours on the Book of Mormon, 8.5 hours on Mark Hoffman, 3.5 or 4.5 hours on the race and the priesthood. Hopefully sometimes having a bit of a longer episode like this isn't too much, too arduous, but I have to discuss something that was, briefly mentioned essentially and briefly discussed in the Mythicist Milwaukee discussion. Now, I relayed the story of talking about the Joseph Smith with the dove in the ear type thing. I have to thank Reddit user Chasing Fanny for linking this over to me. Now, this was the message that Chasing Fanny sent to me on Reddit. It said, I haven't researched this yet, but the bottom of the first paragraph mentions the trained dove, and I was so excited to get this. And that's exactly what this is. And it told me, and it gave the reference, the Philadelphia Saturday Courier and Smith's trained dove mimicking the Holy Spirit as told in the February 14th, 1843 issue of the Norwalk Huron Reflector. Now, I had to go to newspapers.com, which of course is a massive online archive of more than 200 million newspapers, in order to find this, and they had it. And it was, that's where I read this from on the Mythicist Milwaukee thing. I will include a snapshot of this because it requires a paywall to get into. But I'll include a snapshot of this newspaper article just so you guys can read a PDF copy of it, just so you can see, wow, this thing really was reported on. But the best part about this is what it's discussing here at the end. At the very, very last, 2 lines, that's when it talks about the trained dove mimicking the Holy Spirit and giving the reference. But the entire passage talks about something that's way, way, way better here, okay? I'm just going to read this because it's so fantastic. The magazine and Advocate says that while the Mormon prophet Joe Smith was in Ohio, this is in Kirtland, engaged in proselyting people to the faith of the Golden Bible, he sought to give additional solemnity to the baptismal rite by affirming that on each occasion an angel would appear on the opposite side of the stream and there remain till the conclusion of the ceremony. The rite was administered in the evening in Grand River near Painesville, not by the prophet in person, but by his disciples. In agreement with the prediction of the prophet, on each occasion a figure in white was seen on the opposite bank, and the faith of the faithful was thereby greatly increased, right? That's pretty impressive. Joseph says, hey, we're going to do this baptismal ceremony, and an angel is going to appear on the other side of the bank. And, people would see that angel and be like, oh, that's amazing. Suspicions as to the incorporeal nature of the repeated angel at length induced a company of young men, unbelievers, of course, to examine the quality of the ghost, and having secreted themselves, they awaited its arrival. Now, one detail that it left out here that I'm going to get into in a different account, I'm going to stop reading that this is published in the Winchester Republican. I'm going to read the rest of it from a different source. And this is from Elder Moss's Kirtland account, and this was published on page 154 of the 1880 History in Shenango County. To convince the unbelievers that he did possess supernatural powers, he announced that he would walk upon the water. That's Joseph Smith. This earlier account was conflating the angel in white with Joseph Smith. That's what Joe would do. He'd walk across the water. The performance was to take place in the evening, and to the astonishment of unbelievers, he did walk upon the water, where it was known to be several feet deep, only sinking a few inches below the surface, right? That's incredible. Joseph Smith walked on water. He prophesied, I will walk on the water after this baptismal ceremony, and he did it. This proving a success, a second trial was announced, which bid fair to be as successful as the first. But when he had proceeded some distance into the river, and this is where it's talking about the other people secreting themselves, he suddenly went down, greatly to the disgust of himself and the proselytes, but to the great amusement of the unbelievers. It appeared on examination that planks were laid in the river a few inches below the surface, and some wicked boys had removed a plank, which caused the prophet to go down like any other mortal. In an 1835 account, the reputed angel on the opposite side of the stream turned out to be the Mormon prophet himself. Arthur B. Deming gathered up many such tales for his 1888 paper, Naked Truths. That's that, and I have to say that the story of Joe having the dove in his ear, now that's something in and of itself. That was only recorded in two separate reports from the same source, essentially. And the best part about that is, he had the dove trained, and then when he gave the signal, there was just dead silence, and then he stomped his feet and said, "Messenger of the Lord, come down!" And finally the person shouted from the rafters, "The cat ate him, he's dead." So that's essentially how I interpret that story. But this story of him walking across the water, and then the next time he claims he's going to do it, him falling in the river, that was multiple times attested in multiple different firsthand accounts in multiple newspapers. It's fairly historically reliable that Joseph Smith walked on water, and then people discovered he was walking on planks, and they sawed the planks out or they removed the planks. So he just walked out partway into the water and then fell in, as it said, to the disgust of himself and his believers, but to the great amusement of the unbelievers. This is Joe. This is so perfectly Joe, right? He does something, he sets up an amazing con, something happens and it gets completely fucked up, and for some reason, he doesn't lose all of his followers. Okay? If you're a prophet and you have one false prophecy, you're no longer a true prophet. Simple as that. It's a binary system. You're either a prophet or a false prophet. Joseph set up these prophecies, these charismatic, exciting prophecies where he'd, speak to the messenger of the Lord. He would speak to, or he would see something in his hat. He would incite spiritual manifestations in his followers through, I think, drug use. He'd walk across the water, and something would happen to fuck it all up. I love this. This is a perfect story that shows who Joseph Smith is. So there will be a link to that Reddit post in the show notes. And once again, thank you so much to Chasing Fanny for sending that over and, making it so that I can retract my retraction, essentially. When I first published that, I remember reading it, and I remember just the painful amount of eye rolling that I gave at the whole situation. Cause of course that happened to Joe with the whole trained dove situation. But of course, with Chasing Fanny's link to this Reddit post, so much more is, so many other doors are opened into historical studies here about Joseph's cons and the props that he used in order to complete these cons. So thank you so much to that. And, of course, check the show notes for that link to read up more on what it is I'm discussing here. And also for the snapshot for the Huron reflector, where it talks about that, the Mormon miracle knocked in the head. But of course, I think that is everything for today's episode. We will do listener mail segment next episode. However, there were new patrons that we had to thank for supporting the show on patreon.com/nakedmormonism. You guys are amazing. Thank you so much. All right. Wow, we have a lot of new patrons here. Okay, so we have John, David, Roger, Pamela, and Rick. Rick I actually met at God Awful Movies. That was awesome. Rick and his wife. Those are all our new NAMO juvenile delinquents. Thank you all so much. And then of course we have new NAMO adolescent rebels, Vinny and Al. And Shane. Thank you all. Why? It never ceases to surprise me how amazing all of you are and supportive you are in keeping this show running and keeping me doing this full time and pouring hours of research into this. Thank you all very much for supporting this. You seriously have the gratitude from the deepest throes of my heart folds. It's so nice of you to do. Thank you. One more thing to mention before actually closing up the show. I did something that I haven't done in a long time, for better or worse, I'm not sure. I re-downloaded iTunes. Since I've had my computer reformatted multiple times and whatnot, and been struggling with computer problems, I haven't reinstalled iTunes because I haven't needed it. But I used to be, like a hawkeye on my iTunes ratings, and I probably should be a bit more attentive about it. But I saw the most recent review that was left on the Naked Mormonism podcast feed, and I'm just going to read this. I normally do not ever read these reviews on air just because it gets old after a while, right? But this was a very special review, and I just want to read it for you guys to see what you guys think. And then of course share my interaction after that. It's from The Lord's Anointed, and it's by The Second Witness. So this is it, and it's a 2-star review essentially. I find that the host views are both ignorant and colored by his apostate mainstream church and anti-Mormon past. Well, that's probably a fair argument can be made by that. While I find the reading of the text he provides fascinating, it is easy to understand the host's ignorance of how things are run in the apostate LDS church, seeing as how he left it about 10 years ago, 8, and hasn't in any way studied the true doctrine taught by the prophet Joseph Smith. I'm glad for this podcast for at least one reason. This podcast culls out the tart from the remaining wheat and within the dead and dying apostate LDS church and rips those slothful, foolish virgins away from the faithful in part. Good job, Bryce Blankenegli. Keep up the good work. Sincerely, Mark Lichtenwalter, the host of the Mormon podcast named The Kingdom of God or Nothing. And that's the review. So, I'm kind of frustrated about this review. Because if you're going to listen to a podcast and you're going to review it, you're going to, call out something that's inaccurate, tell me what it is so I can make adjustments. If there's something that you don't like about it, please tell me one way or another, whether it's on an iTunes review or personally getting in touch. But there wasn't anything substantial. He didn't call out anything specifically that was wrong. He just says that, he's essentially seeing things from the apostate LDS church because he has his own nuanced beliefs, and hasn't in any way studied the true doctrine taught by the prophet Joseph Smith. I sincerely disagree because I've been reading his history and his doctrine for the past 4 years. And then he says that the podcast calls out the tarts from the remaining wheat. I don't know necessarily what that means. Maybe I'm pulling away people that are less faithful members. So, and then at the end, of course, he leaves his information, his contact information. Mark Lichtenwalter, the host of the podcast named The Kingdom of God or Nothing. Now, you don't do that unless you want people to go look, right? You don't put that up in an iTunes review unless you want people to chase that to its logical conclusion, right? And I couldn't help but look up The Kingdom of God or Nothing. And the most incredible thing is this podcast started like 2 months before my podcast started, like 2 years ago plus some. And he has 300 episodes out. 300! And it ended back in like August or something. He hasn't even been putting out episodes for like the past 4 or 5 months. 300 episodes, and most of them are more than 2 hours long. Most of them are released like successively, 2, 3, 4, 5 days in a row, where every day has a new episode out. And the guy has one review. There's one 2-star review on the Kingdom of God or Nothing podcast. That's it. He's been going for 2 years, 2.5 years now, 300 episodes, and that's it. So I had to give it a listen. So I listened to the most recent episode. That was, after he went off of air, and I couldn't help myself, but I had to listen to it and critique it the way that you're supposed to critique information. So if you look on the Facebook page, there is a string of, I think, 6 or 7 posts on the Naked Mormonism Facebook page where I listened to the most recent episode, and I just hashed out my arguments against what he was saying. And, it was an hour and 20-minute podcast, and I deconstructed it line by line. The right way to actually deconstruct or critique a podcast. The way that I wish that Mark would have taken the energy and the sincerity to review Naked Mormonism. So, I hope that Mark, takes notice of this and understands what it means to just bitch and moan about a podcast or to actually review a podcast. Because if there are things in here that he finds factually inaccurate, I need to address those. I need to come on and publish retractions if they're wrong or bolsterings if they're correct. The story with the dove, with Joseph training the dove. I published it. I talked about it on the show, and I couldn't find any substantiation for it after I was called out. So I said, I'm sorry, I have to retract it because I can't find substantiation, and I want to be as historically accurate as possible. And I put out a petition to all of the amazing listeners out there, and of course Chasing Fanny got back to me, found that substantiation, so now I'm retracting my retraction. That is in the pursuit of intellectual honesty. But the review that this guy left on iTunes is just, it's not honest. It's just bitching. That's all it is. All of the reaching out that I've done to try and get a hold of this guy so far hasn't panned out. Of course, this only happened a few days ago, so we'll see how it develops after this. But, the Kingdom of God or Nothing podcast is definitely, the one episode I listened to is, frustrating to say the least. And if you want to see my reviews and my opinions of this guy calling himself a prophet, and giving the mechanism by which to determine if he is or is not a real prophet of God. Of course, the posts are up on the Naked Mormonism Facebook page back from January 16th, I believe it was. So, take it for what it's worth. If you think that this iTunes review was justified, then so be it. If not, I would love to get a few more iTunes reviews. It would really help with the show's rankings, and, people, TBMs like this guy that leave, 1 or 2 star reviews, of which there have been a few. Those really hurt the show's rankings quite a lot, and it makes it so a lot fewer people actually see it on their What's Hot feed. So if you can't support the show through patreon.com/nakedmormonism, it would be deeply appreciated if you could go to iTunes or Stitcher or your, podcast app of choice and leave a review for the show, preferably good, to try and balance out these negative reviews from TBMs that are not actually bringing any substantial arguments to the table, that are just bitching and moaning. It looks like we have reached a Patreon goal. I can't even believe it. We are going to start doing NAMO home evenings, possibly monthly or quarterly Monday night hangouts where we get together and talk about relationships or about the church or about the history or doctrine or just about current events or anything to just kind of get together and get things off of our mind. A Google Hangout for patrons only. We're going to try and organize something with Marie Kent of the My Book of Mormon podcast to join in with us on this upcoming Monday night NAMO home evening. And that will probably be occurring on January 30th, from what I can tell at the moment. That's kind of the tentative plans for it. But of course, if not for all of you listeners that pledged to support the show, we never would have been able to reach this goal. And I am very sincerely thankful for getting us to there. So now we can get together on Google Hangouts. It's going to be a lot of fun. And of course, we're going to work out the kinks and bugs as we progress through it, and we'll kind of see how things go after we try our first one, and we'll have updates after that. So thank you once again to all of the people that do support the show monetarily. That's awful nice of you. So, of course, that is, I think, everything to discuss. This has been such a long episode. Thanks for hanging in for the whole time. Of course, before closing it up tonight, I need to thank Demonista for running the Facebook page. Recently, she put up a post on there talking about how to deal with believing Mormons, and it's really incredible. I recommend getting on that discussion because the discussion is amazing about ways to deal with non-confrontational relationship dynamics. It's really impressive. Of course, I also need to thank Craig Keeling for providing the artwork that's used in this show. Go to weirdmormonshit.com to see his blog. I need to thank Jason Camo for providing the music in this show that's used with his permission. Go to aloststateofmind.com. Legal counsel is provided by the law offices of P. Andrew Torres. Be sure to check out Opening Arguments podcast, one of the best out there. I need to thank all of the amazing patrons who support the show. Patreon.com/nakedmormonism. If you'd like to be a part of them, you can pledge to support there and get access to exclusive content. And of course, most of all, I need to thank all of the impossibly incredible listeners out there for lending me your ear. Hope to talk to you next time here on the Naked Mormonism podcast.
God damn it. The Packers are up. I knew they were going to pull this one out.
Hey, it looks like both of those may come in.
God damn it. Wow. Sorry. I digress. So that means next Sunday is going to be same shit here. Okay.
The video viewers are getting a little bit of extra content here. Hope you guys enjoy that. That whole digression there.
Packers up 28th.
I hate the Packers.
Fucking Packers, man.
Go Bears.
Bears.
My eyes are just glazed over.
But we don't have any taboos at Mythicist Milwaukee.
Is this a sport where people use balls and throw them around?
Right.
What?
Right.
All right.
Do you know Bart Starr was dipped into the Milwaukee River, hung only by his ankle, and that's why he was so good? I'm sorry, I'm appropriating other myths.
I hate this.
The preceding podcast is a production of Ground Gnomes LLC, all rights reserved.